the white snowfield was said to be the center of the world, a place shrouded in terror where dreadful monsters roamed its endless stretches of ice and snow. Legend spoke of a colossal white serpent capable of swallowing glaciers, a massive gray bear whose steps caused the earth to quake, and a cursed rat whose very presence corrupted the seas. Yet even amidst such horrors, the tales claimed that the true danger within the snowfield was not the monsters themselves. An emperor who once returned alive from that frozen wasteland had warned that something far more fearsome dwelled there. In the heart of this desolate land, a lone man faced a monstrous scorpion-like beast. Their battle was fierce and unrelenting, yet through swift and precise strikes, he managed to bring the creature down. As the dust of combat settled, one of his companions scoffed at him, calling his reckless approach nothing more than the behavior of a barbarian who wore ignorance as a proud emblem. The silver-haired youth muttered in irritation about the torment of being stuck with such fools. The girl traveling with them tilted her head curiously and asked what ignorance was and whether it could be eaten. With a weary sigh, he told her to forget it, recognizing the futility of explaining. Later, he scolded them harshly for devouring food he had explicitly warned them not to touch, as it was deadly. He could hardly believe they had consumed it all in less than a week. Yet instead of remorse, the girl and the bald man with them took his words as praise, proudly insisting that it was a worthy challenge. Before long, the bald man, named Greta, collapsed suddenly, his body racked with illness. The girl fell to her knees, desperately shaking him and screaming his name, while the silver-haired warrior stood in grim silence. Inwardly, he admitted this was never the life he had wished for. Memories flooded his mind, taking him back to the days before this world. In that past, he had yearned for a realm of magic and adventure. He abandoned his work to chase that dream, climbing the highest mountain on Earth, delving into its very core, and even venturing to the southernmost edge of the planet. Yet nothing ever happened. Every night he prayed, hoping to awaken one morning within the heart of a fantasy world. Against all odds, his wish had eventually been granted. That memory shifted into an earlier time when he had first encountered the snowfield. A man trudged forward, his body shivering violently against the unforgiving cold. His companion warned him to wrap himself with more fur if he did not wish to freeze where he stood. They were mercenaries, part of a company led by a determined captain who had accepted the dangerous task of crossing the white snowfield. Murmurs spread among the men, some cursing the suicidal nature of the mission and the false allure of its reward. One of them declared that attempting to cross this place was madness itself. The captain silenced them sharply, reminding all that they had chosen this mission willingly. The man who had spoken protested again, saying that none of them had realized the reality would be this brutal. Meanwhile, inside a warm carriage shielded from the storm, an elderly servant turned to the young noblewoman seated across from him. She was Milena, of the House of Akasha. He asked if she was well, to which she calmly assured him that she was. Outside, the weary complaints of the guards seeped in, and the servant cursed them as insolent curs. Milena gently rebuked him, reminding him that these men were the only ones who had agreed to guard them on such a perilous journey. She even suggested allowing them inside the carriage, concerned by the deadly cold outside. The servant rejected the idea firmly, insisting that she knew well what prowled in this land. When Milena guessed he meant the monsters, the old man leaned closer and began recounting an ominous tale. Long ago, an emperor, driven by boundless ambition, sought to conquer the snowfield and bring the world beneath his rule. He entered the frozen land with his strongest soldiers and champions. Years later, his empire crumbled into ruin, and he himself returned alone. Time and despair had withered him. He appeared decades older and spoke like one broken in both body and mind. He swore of monsters beyond imagining in the snowfield, yet also declared that none of them were as dangerous as the barbarian. He described the snowfield as a living hell, one from which no soul returned. The servant dismissed it as a legend, but Milena argued that many of the creatures once described by that emperor had since been discovered, making his words difficult to ignore. The servant only smiled and pointed out that no one had ever claimed to see a barbarian. Milena conceded this much, though unease lingered in her voice. Outside, the mercenary captain suddenly raised his arm and ordered a halt. His gaze was fixed upon the snowy horizon where a vague figure appeared through the storm. At first, the men could only see a small shape moving toward them, which gave them some relief. Yet the relief faded when they realized it was coming directly at them. As the figure approached, their eyes widened in horror. It was a man, and more than that, it was a barbarian. The figure strode confidently into view, his presence alone striking fear into hardened mercenaries. He introduced himself as Kettle of the Ashen tribe. With a casual tone, he explained that he had grown tired of his own kind and had wandered away, only to stumble upon them by chance. He guessed they were mercenaries guarding a caravan and suggested they turn back, though he doubted they would. Then, to their shock, he smiled and offered his services. He wanted to be hired to help them cross the snowfield. The mercenaries exchanged stunned glances, uncertain whether this was a trap. One whispered that if he were truly hostile, they would already be dead. Another turned to the captain for a decision. Inside the carriage, both Milena and her servant overheard the discussion. The captain cautiously explained to Milena that the barbarian sought to be hired as part of their company. When the servant asked how a fight might turn out, the captain immediately advised against even considering it. After a pause, Milena gave her decision, which was that they would accept his offer. The captain saluted her judgment and stepped outside to inform the barbarian. Kettle laughed with pleasure at the news. Then, without warning, he began walking directly toward the carriage. The captain flinched, demanding to know what he intended. Kettle calmly assured him there was no reason to be afraid, claiming he only wished to speak directly with his employer. The captain warned that he would not hesitate to act if Kettle tried anything suspicious. The mercenaries muttered anxiously among themselves, some asking why they did not attempt to stop him, others scoffing at the very idea, knowing it would be suicide. Inside the carriage, the servant panicked as Milena prepared to step out. She urged him to stay calm. Then, Kettle's voice rang out from just outside the carriage, asking if he might enter. Shocked but composed, Milena steadied herself and granted him permission. Inside the carriage, Kettle spoke calmly, assuring the servant that he had no reason to fear since there was no intent of harm. The servant forced himself to remain composed, though his hands trembled slightly. Milena, seated across from Kettle, could not help the thought that surged through her mind. The legendary barbarian she had only heard of in stories was now directly before her. She greeted him with a mix of nervousness and formality, to which Kettle returned a measured acknowledgement. His eyes drifted across the interior, and he remarked upon the warmth that filled the carriage. It was no small feat to maintain such comfort within the heart of the frozen snowfield. Milena explained that it was sustained through magic, and Kettle accepted this explanation without surprise, as though it was what he had expected from the outside world he had longed for. Without delay, Kettle shifted the subject toward the harsh reality of their situation. He pointed out that the snowfield was unforgiving and that the mercenaries escorting her caravan would not be sufficient for survival. For that reason, he declared his intention to assume their protection, though he added that his aid came with one condition. Milena asked him what that condition was. Kettle revealed that he desired knowledge from outside the snowfield, particularly the information she carried. When she hesitated, he assured her that she would lose nothing by sharing it. Recognizing that she had little choice, Milena accepted. Kettle was pleased with her decision and asked her name. She introduced herself formally as Milena of the House of Akasha. In turn, he gave his name as Kettle, stating it was a pleasure to work with her. The moment settled into silence as Kettle drifted into his own memories. He thought back to a time before all of this, when he had wished with all his heart to enter a fantasy world filled with magic and wonder. One day, he had awakened as a barbarian within the endless white snowfield, with no chance to question why. All that surrounded him had been bitter cold and ceaseless monsters of terrible strength. He remembered leading a tribe, fighting only to survive, and enduring that misery for countless years. Yet no matter how much he fought, he found he could not leave. A mysterious force bound him, presenting itself as an incomplete quest, one that declared he could only depart once it was completed. As years passed and hope faded, he reached the brink of despair. Then, to his confusion, outsiders would sometimes appear in the snowfield, though he could never understand why they would willingly come to such a cursed place. It was through them that he learned the truth. Beyond this frozen prison lay the world he had always dreamed of, a world of fantasy and magic. From that revelation onward, his determination was renewed. He battled monster after monster, cleared the strange quests presented to him, and forced himself forward with a singular thought. One day, he would escape. Information brought by those who strayed into the snowfield became invaluable, for it was the only connection he had to the outside. Unfortunately, most of the humans he encountered reacted with fear or madness, leaving him isolated. It had been so long since he had shared words with someone educated and civilized. That was why this conversation with Milena felt almost soothing, a rare balm for a weary mind surrounded only by savagery. The present returned when Kettle glanced toward the wagons and concluded they were carrying weapons. Milena asked with surprise how he could possibly know. Kettle explained that he could hear the metallic sounds of sharp blades clashing faintly inside the carriages. It was an obvious conclusion, and he followed by asking if a war was raging in the outside world. Milena confirmed this, stating that the Empire and the Kingdom were locked in bitter conflict. Kettle observed that the outside was no more peaceful than the snowfield. Milena went on, explaining that the Empire pressed forward with vast numbers, yet the Kingdom refused to yield. Their borders were defended by swordmasters and heroes. These terms caught Kettle's curiosity, and he asked about the kind of power they wielded. Milena realized he had no knowledge of mystery, and she admitted she did not fully understand it herself, but explained what she knew. Mystery, she said, was a rare power that only a few could sense or wield. Those who possessed it were categorized by ranks. The third rank described those who could merely feel its presence. The second rank included individuals who could actively harness it. The first rank referred to those able to manifest it outwardly, shaping it into mana or aura, with knights, mages, and elemental users usually belonging to this level. Beyond those ranks, the measurements lost meaning, as the beings who possessed such mastery surpassed human comprehension. At this level stood the transcendent, capable of wielding mystery freely, altering the world itself. The swordmaster was among these transcendent ranks. Above even them was the hero, described as a mythical existence, capable not merely of using mystery, but of influencing the very order of the world. She concluded that even those of the third rank were considered mighty figures within their own territories. Kettle listened with fascination and declared that he wished to meet such individuals. Milena was left astonished by his eagerness. Inwardly, Kettle admitted that he could no longer recall how long he had been trapped in this snowfield. His life had become nothing more than a desperate attempt to survive. Yet now he had confirmed he was indeed within a true fantasy world, and he swore to himself that he must escape. Milena eventually asked if he was the barbarian mentioned in the legends. Kettle replied that it could be said so, and he observed the recognition in her expression. She confirmed there was indeed a legend about him. Kettle chuckled and realized that the deranged man he had once encountered must have been the emperor from that tale. He then remarked that the legend was likely true, as someone like that had indeed entered the snowfield long ago. Kettle turned the topic back to Milena, questioning why she would risk transporting such a large cache of weapons through this treacherous land. Milena admitted that her family required large sums of money. Their merchant house, known for its trading history, had accumulated immense debts through the schemes of jealous rivals. This expedition was a desperate attempt to prevent their collapse. Kettle analyzed her words carefully and deduced her intention was to sell the weapons to the kingdom in need, which surprised Milena. Kettle explained his reasoning. Since the Empire fought with overwhelming numbers, it clearly did not lack weapons. That left the kingdom as the likely buyer. In war, when supply is scarce and demand high, profit soars. He concluded that although he knew little of outside economies, the potential gain must be significant enough to risk the deadly snowfield. Moreover, the fact that she was forced to cross this route implied there was no alternative path, as the kingdom's borders were pressed directly against the Empire. Milena admitted his conclusion was correct. She stared at him in astonishment, wondering how someone long regarded as an ignorant savage could demonstrate such insight. The question of his true identity unsettled her. At that moment, the carriage lurched violently, throwing the servant off balance. His startled cry filled the chamber. Kettle remained composed, his eyes narrowing as he sensed what had come. He calmly announced that they had uninvited guests. Outside, a massive deformed creature emerged before the mercenaries. Its shifting form glistened under the pale light, and the men quickly recognized it as a black slime. Kettle asked if that was its name, and Milena confirmed it, explaining that such monsters were documented in the archives. She elaborated that many powerful adventurers had ventured into the snowfield over the years. Few ever returned alive, yet those who did left detailed records of the creatures they faced, and the black slime appeared frequently in their accounts. Curious, she asked Kettle if he knew of it as well. Kettle responded without hesitation, stating that he was familiar with them. To him, they were nothing more than rubbery things that made for a passable snack, something he even considered a decent meal. Milena's eyes widened in horror at the thought, and she asked in disbelief if he actually ate them. Kettle replied indifferently, even suggesting they hunt one so she could try. Milena recoiled at the idea and refused in panic. The black slime rippled ominously, preparing to strike. The mercenaries looked to Kettle for aid, expecting him to intervene. However, Kettle calmly clarified that he had made a pact to protect their lives, not to fight every battle in their place. He would only step in if there was genuine danger. More importantly, He wanted to use this opportunity to measure the combat strength of the outside world for himself. The monster lunged forward, forcing the mercenaries to react. The captain barked a command to raise their shields. The impact of the slime's assault resounded heavily as the mercenaries struggled to withstand its power. One of the men attempted a bold attack, leaping into the air to land a decisive blow. His strike barely pierced the creature's mass before he was hurled backward like a rag doll, cursing in frustration as he hit the snow. The captain quickly recalled the notes he had read before and shouted to his men about the monster's attack pattern. He explained that the black slime could only move in straight lines and ordered them to spread out and coordinate their attacks. The mercenaries immediately adjusted their positions, confirming their understanding of the new plan. They dispersed, forcing the slime to lash out in predictable directions. Working together, they launched counterattacks, slashing from multiple angles. The monster let out a guttural scream as the combined strikes cut into its rubbery form. Encouraged by the sound, the captain urged them to keep up the pressure and not let up. Blades stabbed relentlessly into its shifting mass, but soon the captain noticed that normal attacks were ineffective. He shouted a new order, directing his men to aim for the nucleus hidden somewhere inside the creature. Leading by example, the captain gripped his sword tightly. A faint glow radiated along the blade as he swung it down with great force, cleaving into the slime's body. The strike revealed a pulsing red core within. With a powerful blow, he shattered the nucleus. The monster let out one final shriek before collapsing into a pool of melting sludge. The mercenaries exhaled heavily, panting as they realized they had secured victory. Disbelief colored their faces as they celebrated defeating a monster from legend. Their relief, however, was short-lived. A thunderous growl echoed through the snow, and from the shadows of the storm, another beast appeared. A massive white wolf stepped into view, its eyes burning with predatory light. The mercenaries had no time to rest. Weapons rose again, and one of them shouted for his comrades to target the neck. The wolf lunged, and they met its charge head-on. Steel clashed against fur and fang, the snow scattering beneath the force of their battle. When the wolf finally fell, silence briefly returned. One of the mercenaries, emboldened by their consecutive victories, scoffed arrogantly that the snowfield was not nearly as dangerous as the rumors claimed. The captain's expression hardened as he warned him not to grow complacent. Their journey was not even halfway complete, and what lay ahead would be worse than anything they had yet faced. As the group recovered, attention shifted to Kettle. A mercenary voiced his doubts about the barbarian's strength, noting that Kettle had yet to fight. He pointed out that the barbarian was merely part of the emperor's old legend, not a proven ally. Another agreed, remarking that Kettle seemed to be at the bottom of the food chain here, relying on them for protection. They whispered among themselves about testing his strength. Inside the carriage, silence lingered between Milena and Kettle. The tension outside grew until one mercenary stepped forward and requested to speak with Milena. With measured words, he reminded her that they were mercenaries risking their lives under contract to carry out this mission. Milena acknowledged his words sincerely, thanking them for accepting such a perilous task. She admitted that no others had even dared to consider it after hearing its details, and without them, she would not have been able to try. Yet the mercenary clarified that there was one matter troubling them. The barbarian, despite his reputation, had not raised his hand even once. He insisted that they needed proof of his worth, questioning if Kettle deserved the treatment he was receiving. The captain interjected, claiming that he had tried to dissuade them from pressing this matter, but they would not listen. Kettle, who had listened in silence, finally spoke. He explained that he had no issue with demonstrating his strength, though the time was not now. He told them that before testing him, they should be aware of other visitors who had already arrived. At that moment, a new voice slithered into the air, carrying an ominous weight. It echoed with mockery and delight, declaring its pleasure at the presence of weak humans and calling them delicacies. Shock spread among the mercenaries as they looked toward the horizon. A vast shadow cut across the white expanse, and then its true form appeared. A colossal white serpent rose from the snow, its body stretching higher than the carriages, its scales glistening like ice. Its tongue flicked through the frigid air as it addressed them again, promising that their screams and suffering would only enhance the flavor of its feast. The mercenaries gripped their weapons tightly, their earlier victories now forgotten in the face of such overwhelming dread. The serpent's arrival cast a suffocating pressure across the field, its very presence forcing Milena and the mercenaries to cry out in pain. The air vibrated with its oppressive aura as the ground trembled beneath its massive coils. Kettle stepped forward, his expression calm, and raised his voice against the creature. He ordered it to stop, declaring that the humans with him were his guests and commanding it to return to its place. The serpent fixed its glacial gaze on him, its voice echoing with scorn as it questioned why he was there. It reminded him of the laws of the snowfield, laws that forbade leaving the territory. Kettle responded without hesitation, saying its concerns were none of its business. The serpent hissed in fury, calling him ridiculous for speaking so boldly. Its eyes burned as it proclaimed its identity as one of the ancient serpents, a being promised immortality. It mocked the notion that a mere barbarian could dare to give it orders. Kettle smirked at the declaration and replied that such arrogance required discipline. In the next instant, he hurled himself toward the serpent. The collision shook the land, releasing a violent explosion of energy that blasted through the snow. The shockwave swept over the mercenaries, forcing them to brace themselves as Milena screamed from the overwhelming force. As the light cleared, Kettle stood tall over the serpent, which had been driven back into the ground. He looked down upon it, remarking that it seemed to be the kind that only understood reason after being beaten. Milena's gaze was fixed on him in awe, her disbelief plain as she realized the depth of his strength. Kettle reassured her, promising to end the battle quickly. He gathered his strength once more, unleashing a final attack. Brilliant light exploded from his strike, tearing through the serpent's body and scattering its form until nothing remained. Silence followed, broken only by the wind. The mercenaries, who had once doubted Kettle, fell to their knees, begging for his forgiveness. Kettle regarded them calmly and told them it was fine. He understood the difficulty of trusting a stranger in a place like this. Turning to Milena, Kettle said he had a question. From her clothes and her refined way of speaking, it was clear she was not merely a simple representative of her family. He asked why she had personally taken on such a perilous journey. Milena hesitated, her eyes lowering as the truth weighed on her. She finally confessed that she was the first daughter of Bellica, concubine to Lord Akasha. Her voice softened as she spoke of her mother, who had been brought in through political marriage but had been discarded soon after. Bellica held no power, a miserable woman considered part of the family in name only. Milena revealed that both she and her mother were treated as little more than servants despite their ties by blood. She regretted speaking so openly but admitted that she had volunteered for the dangerous mission because someone had to step forward and set an example. Kettle listened attentively and then told her he understood. He described her as intelligent, ambitious, and even greedy, but in a way that revealed her determination rather than selfishness. Suddenly, the air shifted, and the edge of the snowfield revealed itself ahead. The mercenaries gasped in surprise as the endless white gave way to patches of green grass, a sight that marked the end of their journey. Milena expressed her gratitude to Kettle for everything. He responded by telling her they could now return through the empire with little difficulty, especially once they sold the weapons. However, she pressed him about his earlier words, asking what he truly meant when he called her smart and ambitious. Kettle explained without hesitation. Her once highly respected family was in decline, suffering from a lack of funds. Even as the daughter of a concubine, she had chosen to take personal action, carving a path to restore the family in its time of collapse. He asked her to consider who the people would trust more when the family was at its weakest, the distant lord or the daughter who stepped forward to risk her life. He concluded that her true goal was to seize real authority within her family. Milena did not deny it. Instead, she admitted that his assessment was correct. Kettle remarked that it was a common tale, where the child of a concubine took on dangerous challenges in pursuit of legitimacy and inheritance. Milena silently reflected on his words, realizing that Kettle was not like the shallow scholars she had encountered. His intelligence was sharp, and his insight ran deep. Her thoughts drifted to his unmatched strength, recalling how he had slain the white serpent without sustaining even a single wound. She began to imagine what might happen if that power became hers to command. With her thoughts firming into resolve, she extended an offer. She told Kettle that if he ever chose to leave the snowfield, he should come with her. Kettle declined politely, explaining that he still had unfinished matters to resolve. Milena accepted his answer but removed a piece of jewelry from herself and offered it to him. She instructed that if he ever left and sought out the Akasha family, he should show them the piece as proof of their connection. Kettle accepted the gift with a nod. Their journey together reached its end as Milena thanked him one last time, praying aloud that they would meet again. The carriage soon moved away, leaving Kettle standing alone in the snow, watching until it disappeared from sight. 5 years passed. The snowfield remained as unchanging as ever, yet within its heart, Kettle stood once more, his figure unchanged by time. A message manifested before him, announcing that quest number 1784 had been completed and all conditions fulfilled. Another message followed, informing him that he could now leave the snowfield. Kettle gazed ahead as a shimmering barrier appeared. With steady steps, he approached and crossed through it. As he passed the threshold, his thoughts burned with anticipation. This was the first step into the fantasy world he had long desired to enter. Kettle breathed deeply, savoring the scents of grass, flowing rivers, and distant animals. These sensations, simple to others, were luxuries he had never known in the desolate snowfield. The freshness of the air filled him with joy, and he could not help but shout back toward the white expanse in the distance, declaring to himself that he would never return to that place. For the first time, he felt the reality of stepping into the world he had dreamed of. This was the realm of fantasy and mystery, a land he once believed would remain forever beyond his reach. His beginning had been harsh and cruel, yet he had endured. Now he promised himself that he would enjoy every part of this world. Its dragons, elves, magic, and swords. He believed that his longing to reach this place had been the very fire that kept him alive throughout the endless torment of the snowfield. As he moved farther, he sensed some presence gathering nearby. The sensation stirred his curiosity, and he quickly assumed that it must be a village. His heart raced at the thought of seeing a true settlement, one built by civilized people. Memories surfaced of the barbarians he had lived with, who cared nothing for homes or crafted shelters. The thought of walking into a community with carefully made dwellings filled him with a powerful nostalgia. While considering how to introduce himself properly, he heard voices carried through the trees. One strong voice rang out, declaring to elf villagers that this place would become their new home. Following the sound, Kettle observed a group of elves unloading belongings, their faces lit with excitement as they celebrated the beginning of their settlement. Among them, a young elf asked nervously if the location was truly safe. The elder at his side reassured him that it was. Despite the reassurance, the young elf remained uneasy, pointing out the proximity of the snowfield. His fear centered on the possibility of monsters emerging. The elder responded with patience, explaining that nothing had crossed from the snowfield in thousands of years. Furthermore, they had prepared a concealment barrier of ancient elven magic, one that made the village appear as an ordinary forest to outside eyes. The elder assured everyone that as long as the barrier remained, no intruder could enter. He added that even if something were to emerge, they still had the protection of their queen, whose power even the monsters of the snowfield would not challenge. As these words were spoken, Kettle walked forward through the trees and suddenly felt a tearing sensation beneath his feet. He looked around, puzzled, and wondered what he might have stepped on. Without realizing it, he had breached the magical barrier itself. Continuing deeper into the forest, Kettle wondered how far the settlement might be. His steps soon brought him face to face with a sight that filled him with astonishment. A young elf girl, no older than a child, was crying beneath the trees. She had wandered too far from the village and was now lost and frightened. Kettle's heart leapt at the sight. Here before him stood a real elf, a member of one of the races he had dreamed of encountering in this world. He felt all his years of survival had been worthwhile for this single moment. He approached her carefully, greeting her gently. The little girl looked up, saw his large frame and rugged features, and was immediately overcome by fear. Before he could calm her, she fainted in terror, forcing Kettle to catch her before she struck the ground. Holding her in his arms, Kettle found himself uncertain about what to do next. He had hoped for a conversation, but instead, the girl had collapsed. After a moment's thought, he decided to return her to her village. He recalled the tales of elves as a peaceful and benevolent race, and he hoped that by returning the child, he would be welcomed with warmth. He was eager to experience their hospitality and dreamed that this meeting could mark the beginning of his true place in this world. Carrying the child, Kettle stepped into the village. The moment the elves saw him, panic erupted. A woman screamed in anguish at the sight of her daughter in his arms. The elves reacted instantly, shouting threats and demanding to know who he was and how he had entered their protected land. Their arrows were raised, and their faces hardened with suspicion. The elder appeared, his eyes widening in shock. He could not understand how a human had managed to penetrate their sacred barrier. Another elf reported that there was a crack in the protective magic. Fear spread quickly among them. The elder demanded to know the location of their queen and was told that she had left for a short reconnaissance tour. Kettle tried to explain, his voice steady, insisting that he meant no harm. However, a warrior stepped forward and threatened him directly, vowing to hunt him across the world if he did not release the child immediately. The elder's voice rose, declaring that their hidden settlement had been exposed. He concluded that the humans must have been tracking them for some time and were now fully prepared for an assault. Realizing they believed him to be a kidnapper, Kettle decided the only way forward was to clear the misunderstanding. He placed the little elf girl, who had regained consciousness, gently on the ground. He encouraged her to return to her people. The child looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. She saw not a savior but a frightening figure. Trembling, she turned and ran, her voice breaking into sobs and screams as she rushed back to her mother. Kettle stood frozen for a moment, surprised by the intensity of her fear. He questioned whether his appearance was truly so frightening. In the snowfield, he had always considered himself decent enough among the tribes, but here he appeared monstrous. He attempted once again to explain to the villagers that he was not their enemy. He pointed out that he had returned the child unharmed. The elder, however, misinterpreted the situation. Believing that a hostage had just been released, he shouted that the threat had ended and ordered everyone to attack immediately. Dozens of elves raised their bows. The sharp whistle of arrows filled the air as they loosed their first volley. Kettle raised his head to the sky and wondered if they had even heard a word of what he said. Kettle stood in silence, reflecting on the strange turn of events. In the stories he had grown up with, elves were always described as kind, harmonious, and deeply attuned to nature. They were said to be guardians of peace, the embodiment of beauty and serenity. However, the reality before him was far different. The elves he had encountered were violent, aggressive, and quick to strike. He realized that perhaps the tales he once heard were romanticized illusions, hiding a much harsher truth. The elves, after all, were a race bound to nature, and nature itself was never gentle. It was a world ruled by survival of the fittest, where weakness was swiftly punished. Their brutality, though unsettling, began to make sense within that context. Arrows rained down on him in relentless waves. They clattered against his skin and armor, bouncing harmlessly away, yet the elves continued their assault with unshaken determination. Kettle did not retaliate at first. He remained still, allowing the volleys to strike without effect, accepting that this was the reality he had stepped into. The elves, however, were stunned. The elder, standing at the center of the village, stared in disbelief. He demanded to know what magical tool Kettle was using, convinced that no human could withstand such punishment. With urgency in his voice, he ordered the archers to maintain their fire, assuming the strange intruder's endurance must have limits. Kettle finally decided it was time to calm them down. He gathered his strength and released a surge of purple energy. The air cracked as the blast erupted outward, creating a violent shockwave that swept through the clearing. Elves were thrown into the air, their bows torn from their hands. Trees bent under the pressure, and the ground split open beneath him. When the dust cleared, Kettle stood at the center of a crater, the purple glow fading around him. He declared that he was not their enemy. Inside, he wondered if he had overestimated his control and misjudged the force of his power. Before he could take another step, a blazing arrow shot across the clearing. Wrapped in the fiery aura of a phoenix, it struck the earth near him, erupting into a fiery explosion. Kettle shielded his face as flames consumed the ground. When the fire cleared, a woman stood at the edge of the village. It was Marcelia Hassian Karusha, the queen of the elves. She had returned at the worst possible moment, and her eyes burned with fury. She demanded to know what was happening. The elder quickly explained that a human had breached their barrier and attacked them. At once, Marcelia concluded that her greatest fear had come true. Their sanctuary was no longer safe. Kettle attempted to speak with her, hoping she might listen where the others had not. Yet her gaze only hardened. The elder trembled in shock, unable to comprehend how Kettle remained standing after enduring a direct strike from the queen herself. Marcelia raised her bow again, her voice filled with venom as she asked whether he was another powerful enemy who had come to destroy them. She declared that humans were despicable creatures unworthy of trust. She introduced herself as the queen of the Leaf tribe, then aimed another glowing arrow directly at him, vowing to make him pay dearly for daring to trespass on their land. Frustration welled up inside Kettle. They spoke the same language, yet they refused to hear him. He wondered if Marcelia was deliberately ignoring his words or if the relationship between humans and elves had grown so hostile that reason itself had been buried. It became clear that words alone would not suffice. He remembered the lesson he had learned in the snowfield. When enemies refused to listen, the only solution was to overpower them until they had no choice. Marcelia released her magical arrow. As it flew, it transformed into the massive head of a spectral dragon, its jaws opening wide as it roared toward him. Kettle steadied himself, gathering energy into his fist. At the last moment, he struck forward, his fist colliding with the spectral beast. The resulting explosion shook the ground, sending fire and smoke high into the sky. Marcelia staggered backward, her eyes wide in shock at the sheer force of his counterattack. Kettle glanced at his fist and sighed inwardly, regretting that he might have used more strength than he intended. The queen was thrown to the ground, her bow falling from her grasp. Though weakened, she quickly realized the truth. Her opponent was not just strong. He was at least a transcendent being, perhaps beyond even that. She wondered what reason such a powerful man could have for appearing in their secluded domain. Recognizing his strength, Marcelia ordered her people to retreat. The elves, still shaken from the explosion, obeyed without hesitation, fleeing into the safety of the forest. With determination, she rose and told Kettle that while she acknowledged his strength, she promised he would never accomplish whatever goal had brought him here. Kettle's frustration deepened. All he had wanted was a conversation, a chance to experience the world he had long dreamed of, yet everything had spiraled into disaster. Marcelia raised her voice again, chanting words of power. The ground trembled as flames burst forth. A massive figure emerged, cloaked in fire. A bull with horns of molten flame stepped into the clearing, its eyes glowing with ancient power. The queen had summoned a great spirit, a being of pure fire. The spirit's name was Diego, and his presence filled the air with unbearable heat. Kettle's eyes lit up with excitement. The snowfield had held its share of monstrous creatures, terrifying and strange, but none had stirred his heart like this. This was different, this was true fantasy. A genuine spirit stood before him. He recalled the beasts of the snowfield, many of which were grotesque, twisted forms of nightmare rather than wonder. Yet Diego was magnificent. His horns burned with eternal fire, his form radiated majesty, and his presence embodied the very essence of myth. For Kettle, this was a dream come true. He thought to himself that this was the world he had always longed for. Marcelia pointed toward Kettle and ordered Diego to destroy him. The spirit's fiery gaze settled on the human, yet his expression carried little interest. Diego muttered that summoning contracts were always a nuisance, a tiresome burden placed upon him. Marcelia snapped at him to be silent, unwilling to tolerate defiance. Inwardly, she reflected on how arrogant spirits could be, especially those of high rank. She had only managed to secure this contract through the aid of another tribe, and never did she expect to summon him under such dire circumstances. She ordered Diego once more to fulfill his duty. This time, the spirit tilted his head and asked whether the contract truly required him to kill the human before him. His eyes narrowed as he studied Kettle. Something about the man was off. He felt the overwhelming aura surrounding him and questioned whether the one standing before him was even human at all. Kettle remained dazed, overwhelmed by the sight of the spirit that stood before him. The fire, the horns, and the sheer magnificence of the creature embodied the fantasy he had always dreamed of. His awe quickly shifted into disappointment when he realized the human Diego intended to kill was none other than himself. The fire spirit scoffed at the audacity of a mortal daring to step into the domain of nature's chosen race. With disdain, Diego declared his intention to reduce Kettle to ashes. The massive bull charged forward, its flaming horns tearing through the air as heat rolled across the battlefield. Kettle steadied himself, preparing to block the strike head-on. As the spirit's momentum thundered toward him, a powerful shockwave spread across the clearing. Marcelia, standing a distance away, winced from the sheer impact. When she forced her eyes open, her heart nearly stopped. Kettle had caught Diego's horn with one hand, halting the fiery beast's attack as though it were nothing. Kettle smiled faintly, a hint of satisfaction glinting in his eyes. He thought to himself that facing a monstrous form always eased his conscience. Against something so clearly inhuman, he never hesitated to unleash his full might. Marcelia looked on in horror as the supposed human grappled with a spirit as though he were its equal. Kettle tightened his grip and unleashed a devastating counterattack. The explosion that followed was massive, ripping through the forest with unrelenting force. Trees disintegrated, rocks shattered, and the echo of destruction climbed toward the sky. The force of the blast tore apart the once lush forest, leaving behind only a massive crater. Marcelia screamed as she struggled to withstand the aftershocks of the violent eruption. Dust and heat filled the air until nothing remained of the green landscape. When the smoke settled, the queen looked upon the wasteland with disbelief. Where beauty once thrived, only ruin remained. Kettle stepped forward through the destruction, his gaze fixed upon the fallen queen at the crater's center. Marcelia, bruised and weakened, lowered her pride and begged him to spare her people, pleading that their lives not be taken for her mistakes. Kettle's expression softened as he assured her calmly that he was not their enemy. His voice carried a quiet certainty, and the sincerity of his words stunned her into silence. Time passed, and through long talks and negotiations, the elves eventually accepted that Kettle had not come with hostile intentions. Marcelia offered him a formal apology, admitting with deep regret that they had been too quick to judge. She confessed the weight of their mistake, realizing how shameful it had been to mistake the man who had returned a lost child for a kidnapper. Kettle replied that he understood their fears, especially since they had been driven from their homes by humans, yet he admitted that he was saddened that not one of them had listened to his words. Marcelia then asked again to confirm that he was not aligned with the humans who had forced them into exile. Kettle explained that this was the very first time he had ever seen elves, for none existed in the white snowfield. The mention of the snowfield shocked Marcelia. Her eyes widened as she connected his words with the rumors she had once heard. With disbelief, she addressed him as the Ashen Barbarian. Kettle confirmed quietly that this was indeed the name given to him by strangers. Marcelia could scarcely believe it. She had thought it impossible for a human to survive in that frozen wasteland. With growing unease, she asked whether his escape meant that others could also emerge from that place. Kettle answered that he did not know for certain, but he doubted it. He explained that the snowfield followed rules even creatures as mighty as dragons could not break. For some reason beyond his understanding, he alone had been able to escape, aided by what he described as a quest. His case, he insisted, was a rare exception. Marcelia sighed in relief, reassured that no flood of horrors would come from that cursed land. Curious, Kettle asked her about Diego's state after their clash. He bluntly reminded her that the bull had been split in half. Marcelia assured him that there was no need to worry, for spirits were beings of nature. Diego had not perished, but rather returned to the spirit world. Feeling guilty for her earlier hostility, she asked if there was anything he desired, promising to grant him a wish. Kettle pondered her words and asked if it was possible for non-humans to make contracts with spirits. At first, Marcelia insisted it was impossible, but then reconsidered. She explained that there were rare humans who carried a deep connection to nature and could indeed form such contracts. After thinking further, she told him that if he truly wished to seek such a bond, he must travel to Elfo Sagrado. She explained that Elfo Sagrado was the sacred land of the elves, the dwelling place of their god, and that only there might he fulfill his desire. Kettle asked whether a human like him could even set foot in such a place. Marcelia replied that with her recommendation, it might be possible. She promised to provide him with the location but asked for his solemn vow to keep it a secret. Within her thoughts, Marcelia admitted that Elfo Sagrado was the dream destination of scholars and adventurers who studied elves. Its location was never shared with other races, for humanity was seen as a great threat to its sanctity. Yet despite that, she chose to place her trust in him. She offered him a glowing crystal, a token of her faith. Kettle accepted it with gratitude. Marcelia explained that even if he reached the sacred ground, the god of the elves would surely test him. Yet she confessed her confidence that he would prevail. With a gentle tone, she wished him a safe journey. Kettle thanked her sincerely. Marcelia then formally introduced herself as Marcelia Hassian Karusha, queen of the Leaf tribe, and in turn asked for his name. He introduced himself simply as Kettle the Barbarian. After time had passed, Kettle left the ruined clearing behind and sped through the forest. His strides carried him swiftly until he reached the borderlands. At the edge of the Barkhan territory in the kingdom of Ghent, guards were startled by a thunderous noise and an immense surge of power drawing near. The captain shouted for the bell to be rung and for all men to assemble. Panic spread through the garrison as the ground trembled. Kettle descended suddenly from above, his landing shaking the earth and sending clouds of dust and debris into the air. The guards froze, stunned by his sudden appearance. The captain raised his weapon cautiously, uncertain of what to expect. Kettle greeted them evenly and asked if they were indeed the guards of the territory. The men exchanged nervous glances, their caution rising with every heartbeat. One guard looked closer, his eyes widening in alarm. He noticed Kettle's gray hair, the scars carved across his chest, and the aura that seemed to weigh upon the air itself. A shiver ran through him as he realized the truth. This was no ordinary man. This was the legendary Ashen Barbarian. Kettle approached the guards, who immediately raised their weapons, warning him not to move any closer or they would attack. He remained calm and told them he was not their enemy, asking that they keep their composure. One of the guards, clearly nervous, demanded to know what Kettle wanted from them. Kettle lifted his hand and pointed in a particular direction. The guard followed his gesture and asked what he meant by pointing at the city gate. Kettle explained that he wished to enter their territory. His words left the guards shocked as they had not expected such a request. The scene shifted to a room where the guard captain sat across from Kettle. The captain questioned him about his purpose, asking if it was only to pass through. Kettle replied that he wanted to stay for a while, although he did not know for how long. The captain then asked for his name, and Kettle gave it without hesitation. The captain followed with another question, demanding some proof of identity or at least someone who could verify his claim. Kettle admitted that he had nothing of the sort. At that moment, he remembered the crest Milena had given him, along with her words to show it to the Akasha family if he ever escaped the snowfield. He took it out and presented it, asking if it would serve as sufficient proof. Kettle explained that the crest belonged to the Akasha family and that he had received it from a descendant of their lineage. The captain's eyes widened as he recognized the name. He recalled the merchant family from the kingdom of Denian and noted that their influence had grown rapidly in recent years following a change in the family head. He remembered hearing rumors of a merchant family that had ventured into the snowfield a few years ago, and the crest matched what he knew. Kettle asked again if the crest was enough to confirm his identity. The captain admitted that it did not appear to be fake, though it was difficult to confirm since the family was not from their kingdom. Nevertheless, he concluded that while the crest did not fully establish Kettle's background, it was still useful. He decided to allow Kettle entry under one condition. He explained that the condition was to prove Kettle posed no danger. The captain clarified further, there were already 3 others with unconfirmed identities seeking entry. The condition was that Kettle must form a team with them and clear a dungeon nearby as proof they were not threats. Kettle found the condition far easier than he expected and agreed immediately. However, the captain added a second condition. After clearing the dungeon, Kettle would need to report all information about the operation. Kettle immediately understood the clever strategy. By having the outsiders monitor one another and submit reports, the captain could identify inconsistencies and reveal anyone suspicious. Kettle agreed, recognizing the captain's caution. The captain then shifted the subject and asked if Kettle was truly a barbarian. Kettle confirmed it. The captain admitted in surprise that he had never seen a barbarian like him before, believing they were nothing more than ignorant savages. The conversation ended with the captain ordering him to prepare for departure. The scene shifted again to a waiting room where Alessandro Tyrannus, who called himself a holy knight, voiced his frustration about being forced to enter a dungeon alongside a scoundrel who thrived on exploiting others. Cassin Hark, a thief, responded sarcastically, suggesting that Alessandro was lashing out because another thief had robbed him of his money. Alessandro grew angry and shouted that a thief had no right to insult a holy knight. Cassin mocked him further, pointing out his tattered armor and claiming that no true knight would be in such a situation. He insisted Alessandro was no different from him, just another insect struggling to survive. Alessandro's rage boiled over, and he threatened to fight. Cassin scoffed, remarking that no shabby armor would save Alessandro from defeat. The third member of the group, a priestess named Hayes of Kalosia, stepped in and urged them both to stop. Hayes voiced her unease about having to clear a dungeon with companions like these. At that moment, the guard captain entered. He reminded them that a minimum of 4 people was required to enter the dungeon. Another individual would soon join their group. Hayes expressed her hope that the last person would be normal. The captain answered that she could decide for herself since he had just arrived. Kettle entered the room. The team members froze in shock at the massive figure before them. Kettle greeted them cheerfully, asking if they were to be his companions. Alessandro noted his immense size. Hayes wondered if he was even human, while Cassin immediately felt the overwhelming pressure radiating from him. The captain instructed them to introduce themselves while he stepped out. Kettle began, stating his name and declaring that he was a barbarian. He then asked the thief to identify himself. Cassin reluctantly gave his name, Cassin Hark. Kettle then turned to Alessandro, who introduced himself as Alessandro Tyrannus. Kettle asked if he could use holy power, and Alessandro admitted nervously that he was a special kind of holy knight who lacked that ability. Hayes introduced herself next, explaining that she was a priestess of Kalosia, the god of lies and deceit. Kettle asked why her identity had not been confirmed if she was truly a priestess. She explained that her god was not held in high regard, and therefore recognition was often denied to her. With the introductions complete, the guard captain returned and announced that it was time to depart. The team moved forward in tense silence, none of them eager to speak. The accompanying guard marched ahead and soon announced their arrival at the dungeon entrance. He pointed to the entrance carved into the earth and explained that it was a 3-floor dungeon. The monsters inside were undead, relentless and numerous. Their objective was to clear the dungeon and recover a crest located deep within. The words weighed heavily on the group as they prepared themselves for the task ahead. Each member carried their own doubts, but the captain's condition bound them together. Whether holy knight, thief, priestess, or barbarian, they now stood at the threshold of danger. Kettle remained calm, confident that this challenge was only the beginning of what awaited him in this new world. Kettle turned to Kassan and asked him to explain the plan before they began their mission. Kassan quickly took charge and began outlining the strategy, though he addressed Kettle respectfully. Kettle, however, cheerfully told him to drop the formalities since they were now comrades on the same side. Kassan assigned the roles with a clear tone of authority. He placed Kettle and Alessandro at the front lines to handle the brunt of the fighting, while he himself would take responsibility for scouting ahead and checking for traps. Hayes, the priestess, was given the role of supporting the team from the rear with her divine powers. Kettle expressed agreement with the plan without hesitation, which left Kassan slightly confused at how readily the barbarian accepted orders. Without giving it much thought, Kettle then announced enthusiastically that they should set off without delay. The group entered the dungeon with Kettle confidently taking the lead. The interior was dark and oppressive. Kassan observed the pitch-black surroundings with suspicion. He noticed there were no conventional traps, keys, or mechanisms, which made the place feel unsettlingly ordinary. Suddenly, he raised his hand to stop the group, pointing toward the ground ahead. Kettle looked carefully but saw nothing unusual. Kassan explained that the scattered bones were not merely debris but fragments of skeletons that would rise and attack if they approached carelessly. Kassan realized at that moment that the guard captain had been fully aware of this detail. The dungeon was not merely a test of their abilities but perhaps a deliberate attempt to rid the territory of unwanted outsiders. Kettle repeated the word skeletons to himself, as if weighing its meaning. Alessandro explained that skeletons were dangerous enemies. Even when their limbs were severed or their bodies heavily damaged, they continued to move. Their defense was formidable since they were composed entirely of bone, which made this dungeon far more difficult than expected. Kassan quickly resumed command, instructing Hayes to prepare her divine power and telling Alessandro to ready his shield. He turned to Kettle and told him to be prepared as well. He added that his role would be to exploit openings during the fight and emphasized the need to target the skeleton's weak point at the neck. He warned that striking the neck once would not be enough and that repeated blows were necessary due to the toughness of their bones. Kettle quietly thought that Kassan was proving himself a capable leader. As soon as they advanced, one skeleton rose from the ground. The group readied themselves for combat, yet Kettle stepped forward with ease. He raised his hand and struck the creature with a single blow, crushing its skull into fragments. He casually brushed the magical dust from his hand as though it were nothing. The team stood frozen, stunned at what they had just witnessed. Kettle remarked to Kassan that he had been correct about skeletons ceasing to move once their heads were destroyed. Kassan laughed nervously and explained that this was not what he had meant. Shattering a skeleton's skull with such ease was virtually impossible, even for skilled swordsmen, unless they had mastery over aura. The fact that Kettle had done so with a single strike demonstrated a level of strength far beyond comprehension. Kassan reflected internally, recognizing that the only practical method for defeating skeletons enhanced by dungeon magic was to relentlessly strike at the neck until the neckbone was severed, much like chopping down a tree. What Kettle had just accomplished, reducing the skull to dust instantly, was an act that defied all logic. He admitted to himself that he had known Kettle was strong from the first moment, but he had never imagined such overwhelming strength. The rest of the team stared in disbelief. Alessandro whispered to himself, wondering if Kettle was truly human. Kettle turned away from their astonished faces and calmly suggested they continue forward. The others quickly agreed, though their voices betrayed their unease. Their sudden eagerness to move on amused him. As they advanced further into the dungeon, Kettle picked up a skull and tossed it lightly in his hands, treating it like a toy. Without warning, a large group of skeletons appeared before them. The team instinctively prepared for what they assumed would be a grueling battle, yet Kettle raised his hand to halt them. He requested the favor of handling these opponents himself, explaining that he wanted to test something. Hayes, Alessandro, and Kassan all agreed immediately, still overwhelmed by his earlier display of power. Kettle thanked them with genuine appreciation. Alessandro quietly wondered what the barbarian intended to do. Kettle stepped forward toward the advancing skeletons. He observed them carefully, intrigued by their structure and movements. When the first skeleton lunged, he addressed it in the manner one might treat a sparring partner, studying its attack with interest. The skeleton slashed with its sword, but Kettle easily slipped aside, evading the strike. He caught its arm and, smiling, asked aloud what it would do next. With a sudden twist, he broke the creature's arm barehanded. The skeleton staggered back, almost insulted by the ease with which it was overpowered. Kettle swiftly caught the sword that fell from the shattered grip, twirling it as though mocking the creature's effort. He commented lightly on the skeleton's attempt to switch hands and raised an eyebrow at its persistence. When the skeleton attacked again, Kettle seized its arm once more, snapping the blade and dismantling the limb completely. Another attack followed, yet Kettle dodged effortlessly, his movements fluid and precise. When the skeleton attempted a direct strike, Kettle caught the blow with his bare hands. He smiled again, remarking that the creature seemed to display a degree of intelligence. Hayes groaned in disbelief at what she was seeing. Casson remained silent, his eyes wide in astonishment. Alessandro, however, was struck speechless. He realized the truth of Kettle's existence. This was the embodiment of a barbarian's power in its purest and most terrifying form. Kettle crushed the skull of the skeleton under his foot, the fragments scattering across the ground. He then turned back to the others and apologized for making them wait. The team, however, remained silent, too awestruck by his display of power. Their expressions made it clear that Kettle could act as he pleased. When he suggested that they move on, the group nervously agreed and they proceeded until they reached the entrance to the second floor. Casson, looking weary, proposed taking a short break. Kettle agreed without hesitation, which brought visible relief to Casson. The group sat down and allowed themselves a moment to catch their breath. During this pause, Kettle voiced that he had questions about the dungeon. Hayes encouraged him to speak, explaining that she would answer if she could. Kettle admitted with some hesitation that he lacked much knowledge about the world outside the snowfield. Hayes told him that having the desire to learn was a commendable trait and invited him to continue. Kettle noted that the dungeon was close to the territory and asked whether the presence of monsters near populated lands did not cause problems for the people. Hayes explained that monsters from dungeons rarely left their confines. Although exceptions existed, such incidents were usually handled swiftly before they became a threat. Casson joined the explanation by stating that dungeons often formed naturally. They could appear as caves, towers, or other unusual structures, and they frequently emerged near large population centers. Hayes added that once a dungeon appeared, the local territory would determine its danger level and dispatch groups like theirs to investigate and resolve it. Kettle then asked if dungeons ever appeared within the territory itself. Hayes clarified that they always formed at some distance from major settlements, never directly inside them. Kettle pressed further and inquired whether there were rewards for clearing such dungeons. Hayes confirmed that there were, noting that a boss typically awaited on the uppermost floor. Defeating it yielded valuable treasures, and she suggested that rewards from a dungeon of this difficulty would be worthwhile. Kettle smiled faintly, remarking to himself that the system resembled a game. Hayes asked what he meant, but Kettle quickly brushed it aside by claiming he had only been speaking to himself. He then asked one final question: who created the dungeons? His words stunned the team into silence. Hayes eventually responded that dungeons were not made by anyone but instead manifested naturally. Kettle frowned at the explanation, pointing out that since they always appeared near human settlements and offered rewards for defeating bosses, it was difficult to believe they were a purely natural phenomenon. He reasoned that the very placement of dungeons encouraged people to challenge them, which seemed too intentional to be coincidental. Hayes admitted she had never considered this perspective before. She realized that she had always accepted their existence as natural simply because it was common knowledge. Casson reflected on the matter as well. He admitted inwardly that he had never questioned this supposed truth either. It was an accepted principle, something taught and repeated without challenge. He wondered uneasily how this barbarian could so easily question what everyone else took for granted. Despite acknowledging Kettle's sharp insight, Casson convinced himself that barbarians were still an ignorant and savage race, creatures of cruelty and violence. That fact, in his mind, remained unchanged. Even so, he continued to question whether Kettle could truly be considered normal. Kettle soon broke the silence by asking whether they had rested long enough. The others answered nervously that they had. With his usual cheerfulness, Kettle declared they should continue. The group followed him as they pressed deeper into the dungeon. Before long, they encountered a peculiar object. Kettle gestured toward it and asked what it was. Casson explained that it was a treasure chest, one of the labyrinth's rewards. He told Kettle that if he wanted it, he could attempt to open it. He further noted that such chests required the expertise of a skilled thief, someone capable of intricate lockpicking. Casson lamented that a thief with such skill would have no need to risk their life in a dungeon. He concluded that they should abandon it, but Kettle dismissed the idea and instructed him to open it. Casson stared in shock, unsure of how to respond. Kettle repeated that this was a treasure chest, and Casson was a thief. He argued that opening such things was the very essence of a thief's work and expressed his eagerness to witness the thief's skills firsthand. Casson admitted to himself that Kettle was not wrong, yet he also knew that if he had such skill, he would not be here. A war of thoughts began in Casson's mind. His lack of confidence weighed heavily on him. He was merely a small-time thief, not even recognized by the guild, and he possessed no real ability in lockpicking. His survival thus far had depended more on quick wits and petty schemes than true skill. He feared that if he revealed the truth, Kettle's eager gaze would turn to disappointment. Kettle, sensing his hesitation, broke the silence. He asked bluntly whether Casson was incapable of even such a task, calling him useless in the process. The sharpness of the words drove Casson to act. With fear tightening his chest, he agreed to try. He crouched before the chest and began examining the lock, all the while feeling Kettle's piercing gaze press into his back. His hands trembled, and his thoughts ran wild. He told himself that failure would not simply mean embarrassment, but possibly death, as Kettle might decide he was of no use to the team. Desperation pushed him to recall faint memories of techniques he had observed when working as a porter for a more skilled thief. He tried to piece together those fragments of memory as his only chance at success. Casson steadied his breath and placed all his concentration into the task before him. The world around him seemed to fade until only the chest and his tools remained. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he struggled against both the lock and his own fear. Kettle stood behind him, watching with curiosity. He tilted his head slightly, puzzled by the intensity of Casson's effort, as though the act of opening a chest carried the weight of a life-or-death battle. With a sharp click, the chest unlocked beneath Casson's trembling hands. His voice broke as he declared it open, tears forming in his eyes at the unexpected success. Hayes stepped forward and expressed her admiration, marveling that she had never witnessed such skill from a thief with her own eyes. Kettle congratulated Casson warmly, praising his efforts as though the feat were a matter of great importance. Casson's emotions, however, swirled into turmoil. For as long as he could remember, he had believed he was surviving by doing his best. That belief had been his anchor, the principle that justified his existence. Yet as he stared at the open chest, he wondered for the first time whether he had ever truly given his all. The weight of this realization crushed his spirit, and in that moment, the pride that had sustained him vanished entirely. Kettle asked him about the value of the treasure inside. After a quick calculation, Casson estimated that the contents were enough to support an average family for an entire month. Kettle nodded and asked him to organize the rewards. As Casson began sorting through the gold and items, a sudden shriek of terror tore from his throat. The others stiffened and exchanged wary glances, but no danger appeared. They eventually pushed forward, the tension hanging heavily in the air. As they advanced deeper, they came across another skeleton sprawled lifelessly on the ground. Kettle motioned for the group to halt and stepped forward to examine the scene. His eyes swept over the area, counting the remnants carefully. 4 skulls lay scattered, confirming that 4 skeletons awaited reanimation. He announced to the group that he would take on 3, leaving the final one for them. The team stared at him, stunned by his decision. Kettle smiled and explained that the last skeleton would serve as their challenge. Casson quickly realized the truth of his words. This was not merely another battle but a deliberate test of their strength and coordination. Understanding dawned on the others as well, and though nerves rattled them, they agreed. The bones on the ground rattled violently before rising. The skeletons began to assemble themselves, forming complete figures from the scattered piles. The sight made Casson's blood run cold. Before long, all 4 skeletons stood upright, their hollow sockets locked onto the intruders. Casson shouted for everyone to engage just as Hayes began chanting her prayer. The skeletons lurched forward with unnatural speed. One leapt directly toward Casson, its jagged claws aimed for his chest. Before it could strike, Kettle intercepted the other 3 and dragged them aside, warning the others not to spoil the rare opportunity unfolding before them. Meanwhile, Alessandro raised his shield to meet the first skeleton's blow. The clash rang out, and he quickly dodged the follow-up strike. Casson seized the opening and lunged with his weapon, striking the enemy alongside Alessandro's defense. Hayes completed her incantation, releasing the shadow of illusion. The spell struck the skeleton with force, staggering it and leaving it vulnerable. Kettle observed from a short distance, his laughter echoing across the chamber. He remarked on how rare it was to witness a party fight with such textbook coordination. With effortless strength, he crushed the 3 skeletons he had taken aside, reducing them to piles of shattered bones. He then turned back, satisfied that he could now enjoy watching the others. Kassan pressed his attacks, his movements fueled by determination and fear. He knew this was Kettle's test and that failure would not be tolerated. The others shared the same realization. The remaining skeleton, confused at the sudden disappearance of its allies, faltered for a brief moment. Kassan thought to himself that weakness would mean death, and so he pressed forward with renewed ferocity. Eventually, the last skeleton fell under their combined effort. The team collapsed into brief silence, gasping for air. Their exhaustion was evident, yet Kettle seemed pleased. He reflected that those who dared to enter the snowfield were indeed strong, even if they doubted themselves. With his guidance, the group pressed on once more. The 3rd floor held yet more skeletons, yet under Kettle's leadership, the group advanced with far greater confidence. They executed their roles as instructed, and though the fights were difficult, they overcame each enemy without major setbacks. Hours passed as they navigated deeper into the labyrinth. At last, they reached the deepest chamber of the dungeon. The room opened into a vast hall, where the final challenge awaited. A skeletal knight sat motionless upon a throne, its bony frame draped in ancient armor. The moment the group laid eyes on it, an oppressive aura filled the chamber. The sheer presence of the creature sent a chill through them. Hayes immediately recognized it and explained that this was no ordinary monster. She identified it as a skeletal knight, a formidable being that only those at knight level could hope to face. The implication was clear: the strength of their group fell far short of what was required. Hayes admitted openly that this opponent exceeded their ability to handle. She asked what the outcome would be if they chose to retreat rather than risk annihilation. Kassan responded that if they turned back, the territory would later conduct an investigation. If their retreat was deemed reasonable, the matter would usually be settled without punishment. The group considered this option carefully, weighing survival against pride. Kettle spoke calmly, describing the decision to withdraw as reasonable. Yet his eyes remained fixed on the skeletal knight, studying it with interest. The monster remained seated, unmoving yet radiating waves of ominous energy. The heavy atmosphere pressed against their minds like a physical weight. Kettle took a step forward, unshaken by the pressure. He examined the knight closely, admiring the fact that it retained its form unlike the weaker skeletons they had encountered. To him, it was a marvel, a monster that carried itself with the dignity of a warrior. The skeletal knight slowly rose from its throne, the sound of bone and armor echoing through the chamber. It drew its long sword, a weapon radiating ominous energy. Hayes immediately warned the group of the danger they faced. She tried to block the blow it unleashed with her divine shield, yet the defense shattered instantly, offering no protection. At that moment, Alessandro stepped in and raised his shield to intercept the strike. The impact rang out across the chamber, and the force of the collision released a shock wave that sent the others tumbling backward. Only Kettle remained firmly standing, unaffected by the blast. Alessandro, still bracing against the impact, could scarcely believe the sheer power contained in that single attack. The skeletal knight wasted no time and charged directly at Kettle. Rather than moving, Kettle stood calmly, watching its approach with unshaken composure. As the knight's blade descended, Kettle struck with a single blow. The attack was decisive, obliterating the skeletal knight completely and reducing its body to fragments that scattered across the floor. The chamber fell into stunned silence. The rest of the team stared in disbelief, unable to process how effortlessly Kettle had defeated a monster of such scale. Kettle simply dusted off his hands and asked if that was all. A new treasure chest materialized at the center of the chamber. Kettle turned toward Kassan, asking if he could open it. Panic filled Kassan's voice as he explained that it was impossible. The chest carried a high-level lock far beyond his skills. Kettle expressed mild disappointment and suggested that it was a shame. Kassan agreed and added that they should abandon the chest. Kettle paid no attention to the suggestion. Instead, he lifted his arm and prepared to smash the chest by force. The sight left Kassan horrified. With a powerful strike, Kettle shattered the chest's exterior, breaking it open with ease. The lock and defenses collapsed, and the chest revealed its contents. Kettle remarked that perhaps the reward would be greater this way, then instructed Kassan to collect the loot. Kassan did as asked, all the while thinking that he had never heard of a chest being opened by brute strength. He wondered quietly why Kettle had asked him to open the first chest at all when such force was always an option. The dungeon soon began to dissolve around them. Kassan explained that once a dungeon was fully cleared, it disappeared completely. He concluded that this one did not contain a secret room. The idea of such rooms sparked Kettle's curiosity, and he asked about them. Kassan answered that secret rooms did exist, though they were rare. Kettle found the concept fascinating. When the group emerged outside, they were met by the guard captain who had been waiting anxiously. He was visibly shocked at their swift return, clearly unprepared to see them alive so soon. He asked about the dungeon, and Kettle replied that it had been very satisfying. The captain then stated that they would proceed with the exit procedures and requested that each member accompany him one by one. The priestess Hayes was questioned first. She reported no major problems and provided her account of the events. The guard captain then asked her opinion regarding whether the barbarian could remain within the territory. His hesitation was evident, and he noted silently that his uncertainty always surfaced when Kettle was mentioned. He realized that clearing the dungeon had only been part of the process. The true purpose had been to identify individuals who posed danger. When Kassan was questioned, he admitted that Kettle did not seem like someone who would cause trouble. Alessandro's report followed. He declared that while the barbarian was brutally strong, he had not harmed anyone. He concluded that Kettle was completely different from the ordinary barbarians who were known for cruelty and violence. When Kettle himself was questioned, he surprised the captain by praising his teammates instead of speaking about himself. He commended Kassan for his diligent effort in handling traps and attempting to open the treasure chests. He praised Alessandro for holding the front line with determination, and he acknowledged Hayes for her prayers and support that guided them through battle. The captain found this unusual. In most cases, strangers forced together in dangerous situations seldom showed such respect for one another. It was rare to hear a barbarian speak highly of companions. After careful thought, the captain made his decision. He granted the group permission to enter the territory but warned that any trouble would lead to immediate expulsion. He then presented them with the official reward for clearing the dungeon, instructing them to divide it among themselves. Kassan felt quietly impressed, noting that some captains were known to keep part of the rewards for themselves. Kettle cheerfully declared that the reward should be divided fairly among everyone. The others hesitated and declined their shares, saying they were fine without them. Kettle refused to accept their refusals. He insisted that they had cleared the dungeon as a team, so the reward must be shared equally. His tone left no room for objection. Once the distribution was settled, Kettle enthusiastically suggested they celebrate their victory by drinking at a nearby tavern. The group nervously agreed, though their hearts longed simply to return home in safety. As they entered the territory, the captain reflected deeply. His mind turned to the report he would need to write. The detail that a barbarian had defeated a skeletal knight with a single blow would form the core of his account. He concluded that Kettle was no ordinary barbarian. His power placed him at least on par with knights, and perhaps beyond. He was an anomalous being, one who belonged to legend rather than reality. The captain then gave orders for one of his men to guard the gate. With urgency, he made his way toward the Lord's residence. Before long, he entered the throne room to deliver his report. The Lord of Barkan territory, Luke Barkan, received him and asked for details. The captain bowed and began, informing him of the most significant matter. A barbarian had appeared within the territory. The Lord of Barkan territory questioned his captain, asking if he had truly granted permission for Kettle to enter. The captain confirmed without hesitation, explaining that after their encounter in the dungeon, he found no major reason to deny him access. The Lord asked what the problem could possibly be if that was the case. The captain then explained that the issue lay not in Kettle's conduct but in his overwhelming strength, which could itself become a threat. The Lord pressed further, demanding to know exactly how strong the barbarian was. The captain recounted that Kettle had destroyed a skeletal knight with a single blow. The Lord repeated those words with disbelief, noting that defeating such a creature required at least the strength of a trained knight. His thoughts drifted toward the general nature of barbarians, who were often considered simple, uneducated beings relying only on brute force to resolve everything. Yet he could not dismiss the evidence presented. He reasoned that Kettle was at least first rank, perhaps even higher. The captain confirmed that this assessment was the most likely conclusion, though he did not rule out the possibility of Kettle being far stronger. The Lord considered what this meant for his territory. The presence of a warrior with such power, especially a barbarian who might believe that strength alone dictated right, would certainly cause complications. He finally ordered that Kettle be summoned. He explained that allowing someone so formidable to wander unchecked within the territory was too great a risk, and he preferred to judge the man with his own eyes, despite the danger. The captain expressed concern for the Lord's safety. In response, the Lord reassured him that he was not without protection. At that moment, a huge armored knight stepped forward from behind the throne, his presence immediately silencing the room. The captain was visibly shocked by this display. Lord Luke Barkhan then turned to his knight and asked for his opinion. The knight confidently declared that regardless of Kettle's raw strength, he remained an ignorant barbarian who would be no match for refined swordsmanship. He explained that his own skills had been learned directly from a great swordmaster, and he was certain of victory. Satisfied by his knight's confidence, Lord Barkhan reaffirmed his decision to summon the barbarian and see him face to face. Meanwhile, Kettle celebrated with his companions at a local tavern. Plates of food and cups of ale crowded the table, but while he appeared energized and cheerful, the others looked thoroughly drained, struggling to keep up with his enormous appetite. Kettle remarked on how delicious the food was and praised the peaceful atmosphere of the tavern. He told the others to order as much as they wanted, declaring that everything would be on his tab. Turning to Alessandro, Kettle asked if he was truly a paladin. Alessandro confirmed this nervously, and Kettle followed by questioning what kind of holy power he wielded, since none had been displayed in the dungeon. Alessandro admitted with hesitation that he was still in training, and his divine power had yet to awaken. Kettle considered this unfortunate but moved on, directing his attention to Hayes. He asked the priestess if there was a temple of her god, Kaloja, nearby. Hayes answered that there was not, since her god was not widely accepted. Kaloja, known as the god of lies and deceit, was an outcast among deities, often rejected by common people and rulers alike. Curious, Hayes then turned the question back to Kettle, asking how strong he truly was. Kettle replied that he did not know his exact rank, since he had only recently left the snowfield, and instead asked them to explain the strength of the skeletal knight. Hayes clarified that to face such a creature, one needed at least second-rank strength, and to defeat it in a single blow, one required first-rank power. Hearing this, Kettle concluded that he must be considered second rank in their terms, though he did not seem overly concerned about the distinction. Their discussion was cut short when the tavern owner rushed to them in a panic. He announced that the tavern would be closing immediately, his fear evident as he glanced repeatedly at Kettle. Understanding the man's unease, Kettle apologized sincerely and told his companions they should leave. Once outside, he asked if they had other plans for the evening. In unison, and with barely contained panic, they all insisted they were extremely busy. Kettle expressed his regret, wishing them well and hoping they would meet again. However, in their own thoughts, the others silently wished never to cross paths with him again. Later that night, Kettle rested in a bed at an inn. He reflected on his good fortune, grateful that the dungeon rewards had allowed him to pay for such comfort. Compared to the harsh snowfields he had come from, this place felt like paradise. His mind wandered to the long journey that had brought him here, to the effort it took to reach civilization, and to the possibilities that now stretched before him. The thought of adventure filled him with excitement. He began to imagine where he might travel next: the elf sanctuary, the Tower of Magic, or perhaps the royal capital. Each destination called to him in its own way, promising discovery and challenge. His peaceful contemplation was interrupted by a violent knock at the door. Startled, Kettle rose quickly and opened it. The guard captain stood outside, his expression serious. He apologized for disturbing Kettle at such an hour but explained that Lord Barkhan had requested his presence. The message was simple yet carried undeniable weight. Kettle, though curious about the Lord's intentions, nodded in acknowledgement, preparing to meet the ruler of the territory. Kettle was intrigued when he heard that the master of the land wished to meet him. Rather than hesitating, he cheerfully agreed, his willingness leaving the captain puzzled. The captain could not understand why a barbarian, known for their pride and suspicion of authority, would so easily accept such a summons. Doubt briefly crossed his mind, and he wondered if he had truly come to the right place. As Kettle dressed and prepared to leave the inn, his mood remained light. Once outside, he walked through the streets of the territory, which he had only glimpsed under the cover of night before. In the brightness of day, the scenery struck him as beautiful. The orderly streets, lively townsfolk, and warm sun contrasted sharply with the harsh snowfields he once called home. He thought happily that if this was the sort of fortunate experience his new life in this world would bring him, then he welcomed it wholeheartedly. The guard assigned to escort him remained uneasy. He was bewildered by Kettle's carefree manner and decided that distracting him as much as possible during their walk would be the safest course. To the guard, it seemed almost unnatural for someone of such terrifying strength to display so much innocence and wonder. Soon, they reached the Lord's castle, and the captain formally announced Kettle's arrival. Inside the Grand Hall, Lord Luke Barkhan, master of the Barkhan territory in the Kingdom of Ghent, ordered that the barbarian be brought in. Kettle stepped through the tall doors and entered the throne room, his broad figure drawing immediate attention. Lord Barkhan rose slightly, welcoming his guest. Kettle approached with confidence, extending his hand in greeting. They shook hands firmly, and Kettle expressed his pleasure at meeting the rightful ruler of the land. He introduced himself plainly as Kettle the Barbarian. The gesture stunned the watching guard, who could not believe his eyes. Barbarians were known to bow to no one, yet Kettle inclined his head respectfully. The Lord's thoughts echoed this disbelief. He reflected that barbarians valued strength above all else and never humbled themselves before authority. With a touch of sarcasm, he remarked inwardly that if one lived long enough, one truly saw everything. Still, he acknowledged that Kettle had mastered a form of etiquette rare among his kind. He gestured for him to sit. As Kettle settled into his seat, his eyes roamed the chamber. He admired the architectural design of the castle, which reminded him of medieval fortresses he had once imagined during childhood. His gaze fell upon the knight who stood guard at the Lord's side. Seeing a true knight in full armor filled him with awe, for it was a living image from the stories he had long dreamed of. Yet beneath the polished steel, Kettle sensed a clear and heavy killing intent radiating from the knight. The knight, in turn, studied Kettle with disdain. He considered him a fool for allowing such a powerful aura to flow unchecked in the presence of a lord. In his mind, Kettle had already sealed his fate, for he would never leave the castle alive. Lord Barkhan spoke directly, explaining that his reason for summoning Kettle was simple. He wished to confirm several matters for himself. Kettle readily agreed and asked what needed to be verified. The Lord's first question concerned his origin. Kettle answered without hesitation that he came from the coldest place in the world, a land forever covered in white. He named it the White Snowfield. The reply shocked both the Lord and the knight. They exchanged a glance filled with disbelief. Legends told of barbarians born from that frozen wasteland, yet few believed such tales to be true. Kettle continued, describing it as a horrific place, a land of endless frost and danger. Whether they accepted this truth or not, he left to their judgment. Choosing not to dwell further on that subject, Lord Barkhan asked his next question, one that weighed heavily on his mind. He wanted to know just how strong Kettle truly was. Kettle responded by reframing the question. What mattered, he explained, was not the measurement of his strength but the danger it represented. He admitted that he could not answer directly, for he did not know the standards of strength outside his homeland. The Lord considered this carefully, then proposed a solution. If Kettle wished to learn his own measure, he could do so through combat. He suggested a duel against one of his knights, with the promise of a handsome reward should he perform well. Kettle repeated the word, duel, with interest, and Lord Barkhan clarified that it would not be a fight to the death. Upon hearing this, Kettle's face lit up with excitement. He expressed his eagerness, his thoughts racing with anticipation. The chance to face a knight in combat thrilled him beyond measure. To him, this was not only an opportunity to test his abilities but also a dream come true. He thought with childlike wonder about witnessing firsthand the skills of a real knight, someone who wielded mysterious power and aura. The fantasy of clashing against such a figure filled him with joy. This was more than a test of strength, it was an adventure. Lord Barkhan, however, viewed the situation differently. He noted that while Kettle displayed politeness, the essence of his barbarian nature had not changed. To the Lord, it was proof that a barbarian's beastly heart still craved battle, no matter how refined his manners appeared. Arrangements were made swiftly. The two combatants were brought to a vast dueling arena within the castle grounds. The high walls echoed with the footsteps of those who gathered to watch, though only a select few were allowed to witness the event. Lord Barkhan oversaw the proceedings, raising his voice to announce the start of the duel. He declared his hope that no blood would be spilled and that honor alone would be proven. The knight stepped forward confidently, arrogance clear in his tone as he addressed Kettle. He told him to consider it a privilege to behold the swordsmanship of a trained knight. Kettle responded with calm assurance, saying that he certainly hoped it would be so. His relaxed tone only fueled the knight's anger. Seething with pride, the knight vowed to demonstrate the vast difference in skill between them. He gripped his sword tightly, and as the duel began, he launched forward with practiced precision. His blade seemed to multiply into 3 as it cut through the air, a dazzling technique designed to overwhelm. Kettle was taken aback when the knight's sword seemed to split into 3. At first, he thought it might be an illusion, but as the blades cut through the air, he realized they were real. The technique was unlike anything he had ever seen, and he wondered if this was what true swordsmanship looked like. The knight, confident in his skill, was impressed that Kettle managed to evade the strike by the narrowest margin. He did not bother to follow up immediately, convinced that the barbarian would soon fall before his technique. Kettle, however, moved with casual precision. With a flick of his finger, he touched the knight's sword, and the steel shattered into fragments. The knight froze in disbelief, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Before he could regain his senses, Kettle reached forward, grabbed his face firmly, and hurled him across the arena. The knight landed hard, utterly defeated in a single blow. Lord Luke Barkan, who had been watching from his seat, was struck silent. His mind struggled to accept what he had witnessed. A first-rank knight, trained to the highest standards, had been crushed without effort. The Lord trembled inwardly as he realized that Kettle's strength far surpassed what he had imagined. Kettle turned calmly toward the Lord and asked if the match was finished. Shaken, the Lord confirmed that it was. His thoughts raced. A barbarian had just defeated a first-rank knight with overwhelming ease. Such power was monstrous, and the true depth of Kettle's ability remained hidden. He concluded that a barbarian of this caliber had the potential to disrupt the balance of power across the continent. The Lord considered the situation carefully. He decided that it was time to inform a figure whose opinion and strength carried unmatched weight. Few in the world bore the title of swordmaster, yet he knew one personally. The question was whether that man would take interest in the matter. As if in response to his thoughts, a figure appeared suddenly within the room. A white-haired old man stepped forward with the poise of someone who carried the weight of countless battles. The Lord broke into a laugh, commenting that the swordmaster's sense of timing was as strange as ever. The newcomer chuckled softly, replying that a man needed some entertainment in life. This was Swordmaster Kane, one of the most formidable warriors alive. He asked the Lord to tell him about the unusual matter he had hinted at. Lord Barkan welcomed him warmly, admitting his honor that Kane had come on such short notice. Meanwhile, the knight who had faced Kettle lay recovering in his bed. His pride was bruised, but his body remained largely unharmed. The Lord visited him, asking about his condition. The knight bowed his head, apologizing, and said that he would be able to recover within a few days. Swordmaster Kane entered the chamber soon after. His stern gaze fell on his student, and his words cut sharply. He scolded the knight, telling him that his apology should not be directed at the Lord but at him, for failing so utterly against an unknown barbarian. Kane studied his student closely, surprised to find no lasting injuries. Kane recalled seeing the shattered remains of his student's armor. Under normal circumstances, the blow that had broken it should have killed him. Yet the knight's body remained intact, without a single broken bone. The only explanation was that Kettle had deliberately restrained his strength. Kane found this revelation unsettling. Lord Barkan agreed with this conclusion. He observed that Kettle was not a reckless barbarian acting purely on instinct. Rather, he had displayed precise control, pulling back his strength in order to spare his opponent. That kind of restraint revealed a level of mastery that made his power even more frightening. Kane thought quietly, his expression serious. Restraining such devastating force meant Kettle's true ability exceeded anything his student could hope to match. He judged Kettle to be at least at a supernatural level, far beyond ordinary knights. Lord Barkan pressed further, asking Kane directly how Kettle's strength compared to his own. Kane straightened with confidence and declared that while Kettle's power was extraordinary, he remained a swordmaster. Even supernatural strength could not reach him. Yet Kane admitted something unusual. He noted that Kettle had not used aura during the fight, and still he had displayed such devastating force. That, Kane said, was impossible through ordinary means. The swordmaster wondered aloud if this could be the legendary power said to belong to barbarians of the White Snowfield. Lord Barkan nodded grimly. He admitted that at first he did not believe Kettle's claim of origin, but seeing such power made him reconsider. It seemed to confirm the tales that spoke of barbarians born from that frozen wasteland. Kane reflected on the matter deeply. He wondered if Kettle was truly human. The strength he displayed seemed beyond human limits. Perhaps he was of another race entirely. Yet Kane dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it arose. If Kettle were a creature separate from mankind, he would not have spared his student's life. His decision to hold back revealed an understanding of human limits and a rare consideration for others. Kane concluded that his suspicion was likely a misjudgment. The guard captain approached Kettle later that day to ask about his future plans. He handed Kettle the promised reward for the duel and informed him that Lord Barkhan would no longer interfere with his activities within the territory. Kettle accepted the coins while thinking about the uncertainty of his next steps. He did not have any clear direction yet, but he recognized that having an officially acknowledged identity would help him avoid unnecessary trouble in the future. The guard captain explained that there were only two reliable ways to obtain such recognition. One was to gain the support of a high-ranking sponsor, while the other was to build a reputation as a mercenary. If Kettle managed to collect enough achievements and received recognition from the mercenary guild, then his identity could become officially acknowledged. The captain considered sponsorship the better path, since Kettle's overwhelming strength made him more suited for the protection of nobles. In contrast, mercenaries often started from the bottom, where most were treated as errand boys and endured endless hardships. Despite this advice, Kettle felt attracted to the idea of being a mercenary. He was charmed by the notion of accepting requests, slaying monsters, and carving out a life of adventure. To him, that was the very essence of the fantasy world he had long imagined. He asked where he should go to register as a mercenary. The guard captain, though bewildered by his enthusiasm, explained that there was a guild hall in the town. Kettle eagerly asked him to act as his guide, and although reluctant, the captain agreed. The narration clarified that mercenaries, though sometimes admired as romantic figures, in reality occupied one of the lowest rungs of society. They were often those without status or prospects. Even strong mercenaries frequently met tragic ends, vanishing in unexplored dungeons or becoming scapegoats for dangerous and dishonorable work. When Kettle finally reached the mercenary guild, he was met with chaos. Inside the building, two mercenaries were locked in a violent brawl, shouting curses at each other while the onlookers cheered and placed bets. Amid the noise, a woman approached the guild receptionist, Rosa, to ask about the latest batch of recruits. Rosa sighed in frustration and complained that the new members were all hopeless cases. She mentally listed them one by one: a madman who claimed to be a holy knight, a thief, and a nun who was shunned because of the god she served. Rosa muttered to herself that no respectable people had shown up and wished half-heartedly for a gallant prince to appear and rescue her from her dreary post. At that very moment, Kettle entered the guild, his imposing presence immediately drawing her attention. Kettle paused at the entrance to survey the interior. He immediately recognized it as the guild hall he had imagined from the captain's description. His sudden appearance silenced the brawl, and every mercenary present turned to stare at the barbarian who had just walked in. Without hesitation, Kettle strode to the reception desk and announced his intention to become a mercenary. Rosa, flustered by his directness, asked him why he wanted to join. Kettle replied calmly that he had several reasons, though the main one was that he had heard mercenary work offered a chance to gain official status. Rosa acknowledged this fact but warned him that recognition would not come easily. He would need to build a consistent record of completed jobs. Kettle accepted her condition without complaint, so Rosa began the registration. She asked for his name and age. He gave his name as Kettle, though he admitted he did not know his precise age, so Rosa noted down an approximate one. After taking the required 5 silver coins, she handed him a mercenary tag. She warned him to guard it carefully, since the tag symbolized his standing in the guild. Kettle examined the small piece of metal and accepted it with satisfaction. Immediately afterward, he asked if there were any available quests, expressing his eagerness to begin work at once. Rosa pulled out the registry and presented him with a list of F-rank tasks. Kettle's eyes widened as he read the contents, which included herb gathering, cleaning basements, sewer maintenance, street sweeping, and night watch patrols. Rosa hesitated, fearing he might react with anger. She explained nervously that, as a new recruit of F rank, these were the only missions he was permitted to take. In time, if he built up a record of reliable work, he would be allowed access to more difficult and rewarding tasks. Before she could finish, Kettle interrupted her by choosing the herb gathering quest. Rosa blinked in surprise and asked if he was serious. Kettle confirmed that as long as it was work that needed doing, he had no problem with it. He asked her where he could find the herbs. Rosa produced a picture of the plant and explained that it grew outside the village, scattered through the nearby forest. Kettle studied the image carefully, confirmed his understanding, and departed, assuring her that he would return soon. Rosa was left bewildered by his calm acceptance and unexpected diligence. In the forest, Kettle examined the picture again. He noted the plant's strange shape and wondered if it was used for treating wounds. He resolved that whatever its purpose, he would complete his first mission as a mercenary without issue. He searched diligently, locating and collecting the herbs with surprising care. About an hour later, Kettle returned to the guild carrying a massive bundle of plants. He placed them before Rosa and asked if the quantity was sufficient. Rosa was stunned at the sheer volume. When she checked the herbs, she was even more shocked to see they were in perfect condition. Most mercenaries usually gathered herbs roughly, damaging the leaves and stems, but Kettle handled them with astonishing delicacy. Kettle explained proudly that despite his large and rugged appearance, he had always been confident in his ability to handle things with care. Rosa thanked him sincerely for the effort and handed him his payment of a single silver coin. Kettle studied the coin in his palm. He realized the amount was barely enough to buy the cheapest meal, yet he felt moved by the fact that this was the first money he had earned through honest labor. He told Rosa with great satisfaction that he was pleased with the result and asked if he could take another mission immediately. Rosa stared at him in disbelief, struggling to understand how he could feel content with such meager pay. Kettle explained simply that as long as daylight remained, he wanted to work as much as possible. Rosa could not fathom his strange outlook. She eventually concluded that this new barbarian mercenary was, without doubt, another weirdo. Time moved quickly, and Kettle decided to take on a warehouse cleaning mission for the day. Rosa, who was responsible for managing requests at the guild, looked over his choice with visible hesitation. She noted to herself that this was his third cleaning-related task after herb gathering, and she could not help but wonder if barbarians somehow had a preference for such chores. Despite her doubts, she approved his request. When Kettle arrived at the warehouse, he declared his purpose clearly, announcing that he was there to clean. The warehouse owner, however, nearly panicked at the sight of a barbarian standing at his door, fearing what might happen. Yet Kettle did not cause any disturbance. He entered and immediately began organizing and cleaning. For him, lifting crates and moving goods required little effort. What was meant to be an exhausting day of work for several men was finished quickly under his hands. His next mission was sweeping the streets of the town. At first, Kettle found it somewhat difficult to restrain his overwhelming strength, since even the smallest misstep could break a broom or scatter dust in unnatural ways. Nevertheless, with focus and persistence, he managed to complete the task without major issues. While Kettle worked diligently, someone from afar had fixed a scope upon him. The observer studied him intently, trying to understand why a man of such obvious power was dedicating himself to such menial jobs. He was already aware that Kettle possessed strength that could shake an entire kingdom. Yet this barbarian, who should have been solving everything with force, was quietly performing chores most considered beneath notice. What puzzled the observer even more was the seriousness with which Kettle approached each task. He was not doing them half-heartedly or with disdain. Instead, he seemed fully committed, as though the smallest responsibility carried meaning. The observer, lost in his confusion, could not reconcile the image before him with the legends of barbarians. Kettle, however, felt nothing but satisfaction. To him, there was accomplishment in finishing even the simplest tasks, and he experienced genuine fulfillment in completing the duties handed to him. Later that day, Kettle collected his earnings. Rosa explained that he had now completed 15 missions in total, and therefore his reward amounted to 15 silver coins. Kettle accepted the payment with gratitude, thanking her sincerely and remarking that he would return the next day to begin his second full day as part of civilized society. He then left the guild and walked leisurely through the city, observing the ordinary scenes of daily life with quiet enjoyment. During his walk, he noticed a large building and was surprised to realize that it was a library. Curious, he stepped inside, where the librarian immediately froze in fear upon seeing a barbarian approach. Kettle asked politely if he might be allowed to read some books, though his attempt at courtesy only deepened her alarm. Despite her unease, he moved quietly through the shelves and began to read in silence. Unbeknownst to Kettle, Swordmaster Kane was still watching from afar. Kane found himself utterly confused. The barbarian, who was said to have come from the white snowfield, behaved in ways completely different from the expectations of his kind. Kane began to wonder if the snowfield barbarians were far more civilized than the stories had ever suggested. Kettle, meanwhile, immersed himself in the books. From a history volume, he learned that the Empire had emerged victorious in the Great War. This discovery allowed him to connect the information to Milena's visit from years earlier, when she had been traveling to sell weapons to a kingdom that ultimately lost. He continued reading and discovered that the Empire had grown into the dominant power of the human world. The kingdom of Barkan, where he now stood, was described as little more than a vassal state. The book detailed how the empire had already consumed half of the human world and continued its aggressive expansion without pause. Kettle thought briefly about the idea of world domination but dismissed it as irrelevant to his own path. He turned instead to the section that interested him most: non-human races. He picked up another book, one that contained collected knowledge about beings beyond humanity. As he read, he marveled at how the fantastical places he had once imagined were real in this world. He read about Manhwa, with its vast dwarven tunnels and rich caves filled with treasures. He encountered the description of Pisarabia, a fairy village hidden deep in the wilds, and Lagamaria, the legendary sky city of the Celestials. Then he found mention of Elfo Sagrado, the sacred sanctuary of all elves, a place whose exact location remained unknown. Kettle reflected that, thanks to the guidance once given to him by the Elf Queen, he already possessed the means to seek out this hidden sanctuary. Turning more pages, he was startled to discover that the white snowfield was not unique. The book explained that several demonic realms existed, each vast and forbidden to humans. These were regions where twisted, inhuman beings dwelled, and where mortals could not survive. The text described 5 such domains in detail: the silent forest, the abyss, the deep sea, the hollow, and the white snowfield. These regions were said to be home to horrifying entities called the Others, creatures so dangerous they could never be allowed to step into the human world. Kettle contemplated the immensity of these descriptions, recalling that the snowfield alone stretched endlessly. To think that there were 4 other realms of similar scale staggered his imagination. He closed the book with a deep sense of wonder at the vastness of this world. Deciding that he had learned as much as he could for the time being, Kettle prepared to leave the library. He turned to the terrified librarian, thanked her for allowing him to read, and walked away, while she stammered an uncertain reply. Later, Kettle returned to the mercenary guild and once again asked Rosa about the available missions for the day. Rosa, though still puzzled by his strange habits, handed him the updated list of quests. While Kettle considered his next step, Swordmaster Kane reflected on what he had witnessed over 2 days of observation. The barbarian was unlike any other. His strength was undeniable, yet his behavior was incomprehensible. Kane finally decided that he could not remain a distant spectator. He concluded that he must meet Kettle personally to uncover the truth behind this extraordinary man. Later that evening, Kettle walked through the streets with a light step. The day had been long, but he felt genuine satisfaction from completing another 12 missions. He thought about how even small tasks, when accumulated, could build towards something greater. At this pace, he believed the day when he would be officially recognized as a true mercenary was drawing closer. The thought filled him with pride, and for a moment he enjoyed the quiet rhythm of the city. Without warning, his instinct stirred. A subtle presence reached him, faint yet persistent, as though someone had been shadowing him. He stopped and turned sharply. Behind him stood a hooded figure, silent and still. The figure was Kane, who froze in shock when Kettle's eyes locked directly onto him. Kane could not understand how Kettle had noticed him. He had concealed his presence perfectly with aura, a technique refined so thoroughly that even individuals with extraordinary senses would have failed to detect it. Yet Kettle had seen through it effortlessly. Kettle studied the figure's silence and reached his own conclusion. He believed the one following him was nothing more than a thief. The assumption confused Kane deeply, but Kettle considered it natural. To him, even in safe places there would always be those who preyed on others. Kane panicked inwardly, realizing the misunderstanding would only grow worse if he revealed himself as a swordmaster. He doubted Kettle would believe such a claim in the first place. Kettle, however, saw this supposed thief as an opportunity. Bringing down one who stalked the streets at night would surely look good on his record with the guild. Kane was left bewildered, caught between the absurdity of the situation and the strange clarity of Kettle's conviction. Then Kane realized the error could serve a purpose. Since Kettle had mistaken him for a criminal, he could use this confrontation to test Kettle directly. It was a rare chance to uncover the barbarian's true power. The clash began without warning. Kettle vanished in a blur so sudden that Kane's eyes could not follow. In the next instant, Kettle reappeared behind him, close enough to seize him. Kane felt a rush of dread as he understood what had nearly happened. If he had remained motionless, Kettle's hand would have closed firmly around his neck. Kane released a sudden burst of energy, forcing his body to move with explosive speed. Kettle, watching, remarked on his quickness with detached interest. Kane's shock only grew. He had narrowly escaped, yet what unsettled him more was that he sensed no aura flowing from Kettle. His movements had been natural, devoid of any detectable force, yet faster than anything Kane had ever witnessed. Kettle, for his part, found it intriguing that a man relying solely on his body could move at such a pace. Kane's thoughts shifted. This was no longer a mere test. He resolved to use his full strength. Kane launched forward with an attack, but Kettle slipped out of reach with effortless precision. Kane extended his senses further, attempting to react to the barbarian's movements, but it made no difference. Before he realized it, Kettle had seized his arm. Kane felt an overwhelming pressure pulling him as though his entire body were being dragged by unstoppable force. Pain coursed through him, and he knew he could not win through strength alone. With no other choice, Kane released the seal on his power. A radiant green light surged from his body, enveloping him completely. The burst forced Kettle to retreat a step, surprised at the manifestation. Kane regarded the shimmering aura in his hand with grim focus. Kettle, however, still believed he was dealing with a thief and noted with casual curiosity that even criminals seem to wield unusual techniques these days. Kane nearly shouted in frustration, but he kept his composure. Inside, he struggled to grasp how Kettle could be mistaking manifested mana, one of the rarest and most advanced abilities in existence, for a mere trick. He reminded himself of its nature. Manifested mana could tear steel apart and obliterate a human body with a touch. Yet Kettle had taken it without receiving a single wound. The impossibility of it left Kane breathless. Kettle only remarked that Kane's method was unusual, as though it were nothing more than a curiosity worth observing. Kane was determined to end the matter. He reached for his sword with decisive intent. Before the blade could even leave its sheath, Kettle raised a single finger and pressed it lightly against the weapon. To Kane's horror, the sword remained stuck. He pulled with all his strength, pouring every ounce of aura into the motion, but the blade did not move. It was as if the finger itself had become an unbreakable seal. Desperation crept into Kane as he realized he could not overcome the barrier before him. Kettle regarded his struggling opponent with steady calm. To him, this was the natural conclusion. He looked at Kane, who stood exhausted and overwhelmed, and thought this must be the true state of thieves in this strange new world. The guard captain arrived at the scene with utter confusion clouding his face. He struggled to comprehend what was happening and why Swordmaster Kane had suddenly appeared. When his eyes settled on the sight before him, his thoughts immediately concluded that the barbarian must have launched an attack on Kane. The scene appeared far too chaotic for any other explanation. Kettle, holding the subdued Kane firmly, announced with conviction that he had caught a thief. With no hesitation, he asked the guard captain if turning this criminal over to the authorities would be recorded as work experience for his mercenary career. The captain froze, stunned into silence. He could scarcely believe what he was witnessing. Kane, who had reached the rank of transcendent and stood as one of the strongest figures in the kingdom, was being restrained in such a humiliating fashion by Kettle, a man recently registered as a low-rank mercenary. The captain attempted to explain the truth, insisting that Kane was not a thief. Kettle, however, interpreted the captain's words differently and assumed that the two must have been acquaintances. The guard captain quickly paid his respects to Kane, addressing him with reverence due to the only swordmaster in the kingdom of Ghent. Kettle looked at Kane in open confusion. He asked if this supposed thief held such a grand title. He continued to insist that Kane was a thief who had attempted to rob him of his silver coins. The guard captain maintained his stance firmly, repeating that Kane was indeed the swordmaster and that there was no mistaking his face. Kettle tilted his head and asked if perhaps Kane was a magician using a disguise spell. The captain countered that such a powerful magician would be regarded with equal respect to a swordmaster, which only led Kettle to question further if swordmaster was merely another title for thieves. The captain reaffirmed once again that Kane was truly the swordmaster, leaving Kettle more perplexed than before. With the tension growing heavier, the captain realized the matter was beyond him. He resolved that he must report this situation to the Lord. When the Lord was informed, he was left in shock. The idea that Master Kane had been defeated seemed impossible to accept. Later, Kettle sat quietly, his thoughts drifting toward regret. He admitted inwardly that he should have listened to the full explanation before jumping to conclusions. Kane, equally burdened by the weight of misunderstanding, admitted fault himself, acknowledging that he had been too silent when he should have clarified matters. Together, the two men sat in an atmosphere of mutual regret, each recognizing the other's perspective. The Lord, however, remained troubled. He pondered the possibility that the barbarian had indeed defeated the swordmaster. His thoughts turned toward unsettling conclusions. If Kettle had overpowered Kane, This meant the barbarian possessed strength greater than even the kingdom's most celebrated warrior. He analyzed the situation carefully. Among transcendent beings, there were clear differences in strength, and while Cain might stand at the lower rank within that realm, the fact remained that a barbarian had defeated him. This revelation revealed Kettle as an uncontrollable force, one that the kingdom might struggle to manage. The weight of the realization exhausted the Lord. In the end, he chose to step aside, allowing the two men to speak freely and clear the misunderstanding themselves. Left together, Cain reflected in silence on his complete defeat. The humiliation of it pressed heavily on his pride. At last, he chose to address Kettle formally. With steady composure, he introduced himself as Cain, the swordmaster. Kettle frowned slightly, misunderstanding the declaration, and asked if swordmaster was Cain's family name. Cain explained that once an individual attained such a rank, common titles lost their meaning. Kettle nodded slowly, piecing the information together. He asked if the technique Cain had displayed earlier was the power of a swordmaster. In response, Cain allowed his aura to manifest, surrounding himself in its brilliant glow. Kettle's eyes widened with admiration. He declared that now that he understood it was the technique of a swordmaster, he found it truly remarkable. Cain explained patiently that what Kettle was seeing was called the manifestation of mystery, more commonly known as aura. Kettle realized then that the green energy he had seen before had been aura all along. His curiosity surged. He eagerly asked how to use it for himself. Cain responded that mystery was not something to wield lightly. It required strict control and manifestation before it could serve as aura. Kettle pressed further, wondering aloud if mystery was similar to mana. Cain clarified that mystery was the source itself, the mysterious energy that lay at the heart of both paths. Those who channeled it as mana became magicians, while those who controlled it as aura became swordsmen. Hearing this, Kettle admitted sheepishly that his knowledge of the world was still limited. In his earnestness, he asked Cain to teach him the technique. He repeated his request insistently, showing no hesitation in his desire to learn. Cain was taken aback by the boldness of the request. He questioned aloud why Kettle, the one who had just defeated him, would ask him for guidance. Kettle replied sincerely that if Cain had drawn his sword during their confrontation, the outcome might have been entirely different. He reasoned that Cain's mastery of the blade remained beyond his own understanding, and he expressed unrestrained excitement at the possibility of learning from him. Cain, however, felt his pride waver. The request, though genuine, struck at the sore wound of his defeat. He worried that accepting might shatter his confidence further. Kettle reflected on his past experiences, realizing that the swordsmanship he had once practiced in his former life seemed almost primitive compared to what he was witnessing now. What Cain revealed was not mere swordplay but true fantasy swordsmanship, shaped and empowered by the mysterious force of aura. This was not simply the art of swinging blades but a deeper craft that merged illusion, reality, and mystery itself. Cain began his explanation by introducing the core of his school of swordsmanship. He stated that its hallmark lay in the embodiment of illusion and reality. To guide Kettle's understanding, Cain asked what he had perceived when he fought against his student. Kettle paused, remembering that the knight he had faced earlier had indeed been under Cain's tutelage. He recalled how the knight's sword strikes had multiplied into 3, each one tangible and real. With that recollection, he understood that this was the meaning of embodiment. Cain elaborated further, emphasizing that his style was built upon refined technique rather than raw strength. Swordsmanship, he explained, was the art of fusing the sword with aura to wield mystery. Those who reached the end of this arduous path were acknowledged as swordmasters. Kettle, hearing these words, became fascinated by the concept of aura. Cain, however, still could not hide his disbelief that he was teaching such profound knowledge to a barbarian. Unable to reconcile his feelings, he chose to demonstrate rather than speak further. Cain drew his sword and executed a flawless strike. Kettle watched closely as the single movement split into 5 distinct strikes, each one sharp and precise. Cain clarified that while many styles used aura to create illusions, his own style alone gave form to those illusions, making them real. He then asked Kettle for his opinion on the demonstration. Kettle, brimming with confidence, responded that he believed he could replicate it. Cain was stunned, dismissing the claim as foolishness. He thought of the years he had devoted to perfecting this skill, the countless struggles and sacrifices he had endured, and could not accept that Kettle might imitate it after a single display. Kettle, however, declared that proving it through action was far simpler than debate. He reached for his axe, adopted a stance, and attacked. Kane's initial impression was that Kettle was relying purely on brute force and speed. Yet when the strike landed, the wall bore 5 distinct marks, mirroring the effect of Kane's technique. Smoke rose from the axe as Kettle calmly asked for Kane's judgment. Kane, although shaken, admitted to himself that the result was remarkably similar. Still, he argued aloud that Kettle's display was nothing more than speed without technique and insisted that true swordsmanship demanded more than raw power. Kettle countered by questioning whether the result itself was not sufficient proof. Kane found himself trapped in frustration, because he knew that Kettle's words, however unrefined, carried undeniable truth. Unable to accept the challenge to his pride, Kane unsheathed his sword once more. Fueled by emotion, he unleashed one of his most advanced techniques. The force of the attack made Kettle briefly wonder if his body was being torn apart. Kane explained that this was the body separation technique, achieved by pushing aura control to its utmost limit. He then challenged Kettle to replicate it. Kettle responded by unleashing his own whirlwind strike with the axe, relying on sheer physical force. The overwhelming power of the attack shattered Kane's technique and destroyed the arena around them. When the dust settled, Kettle once again asked Kane for his opinion. Kane collapsed to his knees, devastated by what he had just witnessed. His heart broke under the weight of despair, and he cried out that the meaning of his swordsmanship, the purpose of his life's dedication, had been overturned. He could not believe such a situation was possible. Kettle observed him calmly, remarking that Kane seemed more fragile in spirit than he had expected. He then tried to ease Kane's despair by praising his swordsmanship, claiming that his own display was nothing more than fast axe swings, not true swordsmanship. Kane reflected on those words and realized there was truth in them. He admitted that Kettle's technique was real in its own right, born from raw power rather than illusion. He recognized that he himself could never achieve that form of mystery. Yet, to steady himself, Kane reminded his heart that his path still had meaning. He reassured himself that his art of embodying illusion and reality remained unique. Rising from his despair, Kane loudly declared that his swordsmanship was flawless in its own right, insisting that Kettle's feats were simply inhuman. He claimed that for someone to move with such speed that real illusions were created without aura was madness beyond human capability. Witnessing Kane's emotional outburst, Kettle asked calmly if Kane could instead teach him the true meaning of technique. Kane regained his composure and apologized for losing control of his emotions. Kettle replied that he understood. Kane then began a structured lesson. He explained that in order to wield true technique, one must first learn to control aura. To control aura, however, it was necessary to understand mystery itself. He emphasized that no mage, swordsman, or sorcerer could ever rise to the highest levels without this understanding. Only those blessed with divine power could bypass it, since their miracles were gifts from gods rather than personal cultivation. Kettle asked whether divine power was separate from mystery. Kane confirmed this, clarifying that divine miracles did not stem from individual strength but were granted externally. Kettle nodded in acknowledgement. Kane then defined mystery as the inherent power within oneself. The way it was handled determined everything. Those who shaped it into mana became magicians, while those who manifested it as aura became swordsmen. Kane expanded on the subject, explaining that the ability to wield mystery was categorized into levels. There were 5 stages, beginning with the simplest, unveiling the mystery. This stage meant knowing, perceiving, and sensing the presence of mystery. Kettle then asked if anyone could sense it. Kane answered firmly that only the gifted could do so. He explained that those capable of perceiving mystery at this basic level were called third rank. Kane then outlined the 5 classifications based on one's mastery over mystery: third rank, second rank, first rank, transcendent, and hero. Each level marked an enormous leap in ability, and the distance between them was so vast that comparing them often seemed meaningless. Kettle recalled a conversation he had once shared with Milena and realized this was what she had meant. Kane reminded Kettle that the ranking system was merely a human convenience, but the power differences between each step could not be overstated. Kettle affirmed his understanding, showing clear focus on the lesson. Kane then declared that their training would begin immediately. He announced that the first stage was to learn how to sense mystery, a task simple in words but daunting in practice. Kane instructed Kettle to expand his senses to their absolute limit so he might touch upon the mystery. He explained that this required awakening senses that had never been felt before. To aid him, he told him to focus on the breeze, the touch of the earth beneath his feet, and the shifting winds, distinguishing the subtle differences in their movements. Kettle closed his eyes and tried to follow the instructions carefully. He remained still for a long time, attempting to sense what Cain described, but eventually opened his eyes and admitted that he felt nothing. Cain was surprised. He had expected that someone as strong as Kettle would grasp it quickly. He remarked that those with powerful bodies often possessed an easier path towards sensing the mystery, but he began to think Kettle might be an exception. As he pondered this, he wondered aloud if the peculiarity of the white snowfield, where Kettle had grown up, played a part in his failure. Kettle replied with uncertainty, saying he did not know. He added that among the people he had known in the snowfield, none had ever spoken of feeling anything like the mystery. Cain decided to attempt another method. He told Kettle he would transfer power directly to him, hoping to guide him through the process. Kettle asked if this meant aura would be transferred. Cain confirmed that it was similar and told him to prepare. Placing his hand upon Kettle, he instructed him to relax and focus inwards so that he might sense the flow of power. As Cain began, his thoughts raced. He was stunned by what he felt. The barbarian's body was unlike anything he had encountered before. It was as if the density of Kettle's muscles made him less human and more like solid stone. Cain hesitated for a moment, almost withdrawing, but when Kettle noticed, he apologized and said he would continue. He started to transfer his aura, reminding himself that the true goal was to awaken the latent mystery within Kettle. However, as his aura flowed, Cain felt a second shock. He realized he could not locate the path of mystery within Kettle's body. He tried again, reaching deeper, but it was like diving into a bottomless sea where his aura touched nothing, or pressing against an endless mass of overwhelming density. He finally stopped and admitted in frustration that it was no use. Kettle asked in a worried tone if this meant he lacked talent altogether. Cain clarified that this was not the case. He explained that in the end, each person had to find the path themselves. Kettle accepted this, though he looked uncertain. Cain then revealed a troubling detail, saying that he had not only failed to find Kettle's path but could not even confirm if it existed within him at all. Kettle's shock deepened at those words. He asked if this meant he could never sense the mystery. Cain denied that, stating that the difficulty lay in Kettle's unusual body. The structure was so deep and heavy that aura could not properly reach inside. He admitted this was the first time he had ever seen pure physical strength act as an obstacle to aura. Kettle grew frustrated, questioning if even a swordmaster could not help him. Cain reluctantly admitted that he could not say for certain. He concluded that he could not confirm whether the path of mystery existed within Kettle, and suggested that he might visit other swordmasters with greater expertise in handling aura, or perhaps seek guidance at the Tower of Magic. Cain apologized for failing him. Kettle, however, said it was enough for now. He acknowledged that there was still a possibility for him to learn and expressed gratitude, saying he had gained much from the experience already. Cain reflected on this exchange. Every barbarian he had met before had lived wild lives of plunder, violence, and endless drink, but Kettle was different. He asked Kettle whether he had ever considered settling in the kingdom. Kettle asked what he meant by that. Cain explained that he was suggesting loyalty to the kingdom, which would earn him a title and a place among the nobles. He added that with Kettle's strength, a high rank would be guaranteed, and that he himself would serve as Kettle's sponsor. Kettle immediately rejected the idea, saying he had no desire to be bound by such things. Cain had secretly hoped that if he could bring Kettle into the palace, the kingdom might break free from the empire's control. He tried again, asking if the lure of nobility was not enticing. Kettle replied firmly that he intended to live freely and enjoy his own pleasures. Cain realized that the decision was final and accepted it. Kettle thanked him once more and promised he would not forget the favor. As Cain walked away, he reflected bitterly on the idea he had entertained. For a fleeting moment, he had thought Kettle might be controlled. Now he saw clearly that such a thought was absurd. The barbarian acted only according to his own will. This made him more troublesome than others of his kind, precisely because he was so unpredictable. Later, Cain discussed the matter with Lord Barkan. With a heavy sigh, Cain questioned what the emperor was thinking in his desire to conquer the demonic realms. Lord Barkan was shocked, realizing that the emperor's ambitions truly pointed toward such a conquest. He asked if the emperor was serious, noting that scouts were already being sacrificed under the pretense of reconnaissance. Cain confirmed that the emperor was serious. He speculated that the emperor might believe himself the reincarnation of the ancient emperor. Lord Barkan shook his head, saying that this was a concern for the future since the empire had not yet conquered all of humanity's lands. Nevertheless, he concluded that invasion would come one day. Cain agreed, pointing out that a summons might arrive at any moment, since their region was imperial territory as well. Cain lamented that the world was already strange enough without a half-mad emperor. Lord Barkan then wondered aloud if the rumors were true. Cain confirmed they were, explaining that demons had already begun to stir. Although nothing was fully verified, dungeons were appearing at abnormal rates, and there were whispers that distortions from the demonic world had begun to leak into their own. He concluded that something dangerous was unfolding, and none of it favored humanity. With a weary tone, Cain added that perhaps the strangest thing had already arrived, meaning Kettle. Lord Barkan agreed. When Cain asked for his assessment, the Lord admitted he did not know. Lord Barkan gave his final judgment of Kettle. He told Cain that at least the barbarian was not openly hostile to them, but beyond that, there was nothing more certain to say. The next morning, Kettle wandered through the city streets, observing the people around him. He quickly noticed that their reactions to his presence were unusual. Wherever he walked, citizens grew pale, froze in place, or hurried away as though a beast had entered their midst. Children clung to their mothers, and vendors averted their eyes, whispering in nervous tones. Kettle frowned, puzzled by the panic that seemed to spread in his wake. He considered the possibility that their fear was not directed at him as a person but at his appearance. After reflecting for a moment, he concluded that the animal hide clothes he wore were to blame. In his homeland, garments stitched from the hides of beasts were a mark of strength, yet in this city they seemed to provoke fear. Believing he had uncovered the reason, he enthusiastically decided to correct the problem. He would buy proper clothes, civilized attire like those worn by the people around him. With this determination, Kettle stepped into a nearby clothing shop. The shop owner, an older man with a lined face, looked up from his work and immediately froze in terror. His hands trembled as his eyes locked on Kettle, and sweat formed at his brow. To him, it was as though a dangerous predator had entered his store. Kettle, oblivious to the fear, politely asked if he could purchase clothing. The shop owner stammered an apology, claiming that nothing in his shop could possibly fit Kettle's massive frame. He quickly added that he could, however, prepare a custom outfit if given enough time. Kettle's face brightened with satisfaction at this offer. He agreed without hesitation, pleased to have a solution. The shopkeeper bowed nervously, promising to call for him when the order was ready. Inwardly, the man prayed that when the day came, Kettle would be pleased with the outfit. He dreaded to imagine what would happen if the barbarian rejected the clothes. Leaving the store, Kettle walked with satisfaction, believing he was one step closer to blending in with civilized society. On his way toward the guild hall, he suddenly noticed something unusual on the ground. A faint blue glow caught his attention. He bent down and picked up a small gem that shimmered faintly in his palm. It was unlike any stone he had ever seen, its glow steady and calm, as if alive. Curious, Kettle decided he would ask about it at the guild hall. When he arrived, he approached Rosa, who stood behind the counter organizing paperwork. He held out the gem and asked if she recognized it, explaining that he had found it on his way there. He remarked that it did not resemble an ordinary bead or gem. Rosa examined the item closely. She turned it in her hands, noting that it seemed polished and handmade rather than naturally formed. She admitted that it did not match the properties of known gemstones, nor did it bear any recognized name. Yet she could not deny that it radiated a sense of value. As she studied it more carefully, a faint light flickered from its surface. Suddenly, Rosa's eyes glazed over, and she entered a trance-like state. Kettle immediately leaned forward, snapping his fingers in front of her face. He asked if she was well, his tone filled with concern. Rosa blinked rapidly, returning to herself. Confused, she apologized and admitted she did not know what had just happened. Kettle told her it seemed as though her mind had been drawn into the gem before she abruptly snapped out of it. He shrugged, dismissing the incident as strange but not alarming. Despite his casual attitude, Rosa felt unsettled. The gem gave off a strange and difficult to identify energy. She suggested that Kettle should have it properly appraised. Kettle, however, declined politely. He explained that he preferred to discover its secrets on his own, believing that was part of the fun of adventuring. He quickly changed the subject, asking what quests were available that day. Rosa handed him the quest list, which was filled with the same kind of simple jobs he had been doing. Kettle studied the board carefully before selecting his tasks. That evening, after completing another round of errands and smaller missions, Kettle returned to his lodging. He lay back and reflected on the day with satisfaction. His progress as a mercenary was steady, and he felt content with his accomplishments. As he rested, he retrieved the strange blue gem once more, turning it over in his hand and recalling how it had affected Rosa earlier. He wondered what its true nature might be. As he contemplated, an unexpected phenomenon occurred. A faint voice resonated within his mind. At first, Kettle sat up, glancing around the empty room, but quickly realized that the sound came not from the air but from the gem itself. The voice urged him to come, whispering insistently into his thoughts. Kettle raised his brow, amused rather than alarmed. He asked himself if the voice was directing him to a specific place. Almost immediately, a faint map etched itself into his mind, guiding him toward a distant location. He chuckled, wondering if this was a form of mind control magic. After considering it briefly, he decided he would follow the instructions. Before leaving, he addressed the gem aloud, telling the insistent voice to be silent since he was already on his way. He then rose and followed the mental map through the city's alleys and outskirts until he reached a secluded and shadowed corner. The location was hidden from sight, and the air there felt unnaturally cold. He looked around, asking himself if this was truly the place. At that moment, a magical entrance shimmered into existence before him. It pulsed faintly with power, forming an archway of dark energy. Without hesitation, Kettle stepped forward and entered. Inside, he raised his voice, announcing his arrival and demanding to know who had summoned him. The air grew heavy as a sinister presence filled the chamber. A deep and mocking voice echoed through the shadows, proclaiming that another sacrifice had arrived. It sneered that this time, a foolish barbarian would serve well as an offering. As the voice grew louder, the figure of an undead sorcerer materialized. Cloaked in rotting robes and radiating malice, the lich declared that the ritual of his resurrection would now begin. The lich's tale stretched back to an age when chaos ruled the land. In those days, he had been a sorcerer of terrible ambition, weaving spells to bend kings to his will and ignite wars across kingdoms. His manipulations drenched the world in fire and blood until at last the truth of his deeds came to light. A group of heroes rose against him, and through their strength and unity, they brought about his downfall. Yet, at the moment when his defeat seemed inevitable, the sorcerer enacted a final spell. He poured his soul into a prepared vessel, shedding mortality and transforming into an undead being. From that day forward, he became a lich. A lich was no ordinary creature. Unlike other sorcerers, who faded into dust with time, this being anchored its soul into a vessel, ensuring that even the destruction of its body could not erase its existence. Immortality, however, came with conditions. To rebuild his strength and fully restore his form, the lich required countless souls as sacrifices. He settled in a remote and forgotten corner of the world where no heroes roamed, planting enchanted beads across the land. These beads shimmered with unnatural light, designed to lure the unsuspecting one by one into his lair. The lich believed his scheme was flawless. He imagined peasants, wanderers, and the weak being slowly drawn to his hidden dungeon, providing him with the souls necessary for his resurrection. Yet his confidence wavered when he saw Kettle step boldly into the chamber. The barbarian's massive frame and calm presence unsettled him. This was not the sort of victim he expected. He had chosen isolation precisely to avoid attracting warriors, yet here was one standing before his throne. The lich observed him carefully, his skeletal fingers curling over the armrests of his chair. He thought Kettle's sheer size would make him a fine sacrifice to fuel the ritual. He explained his snare, boasting that the enchanted beads were crafted to draw in only those ignorant of mystery. To his understanding, anyone with even the slightest grasp of mystical energy would resist the pull. Thus, he concluded that Kettle was nothing more than an ordinary barbarian, too unlearned to sense danger. The lich assumed that Kettle's resistance to the magic was either a fluke or the product of an artifact protecting his mind. The lich's voice echoed through the dark chamber as he invited Kettle to become the foundation of his grand resurrection. He promised that the barbarian's soul would be the keystone of his return to power. Kettle, however, appeared unconcerned. As the heavy doors of the chamber creaked shut behind him, he looked upon the throne with unmasked delight. His eyes widened with excitement at the sight of the skeletal figure seated like a monarch. He realized he was standing before a true lich, a creature that belonged to the legends of fantasy worlds he had often imagined. Instead of fear, he felt exhilaration. The lich's hollow eyes glowed faintly as he studied the barbarian. He demanded to know how Kettle had resisted the magic of the bead. All around the chamber, bones and scraps of clothing scattered across the floor revealed the grim fate of past victims. Kettle quickly understood that the lich had been using the enchanted beads to lure people here and consume their souls. Still, the lich remained baffled. He could not sense any mystery from Kettle, no aura of mystical training or magical presence. That led him to believe the barbarian must be carrying a rare artifact capable of shielding his mind. Kettle, in turn, denied such a claim, insisting he had no such trinket. The lich dismissed the denial, stating that if Kettle had truly been affected, he would have walked past the bead peacefully rather than seizing it. Convinced that force was the only way forward, the lich lifted his staff and summoned his servants. From the ground rose skeletal figures clad in broken armor, clattering weapons in hand. They gathered around Kettle with hollow stares and jaws agape. Kettle, watching them approach, pieced the situation together. He realized that this place was indeed a dungeon, and the lich was its master. Without hesitation, he swung his weapon with devastating strength. His first blow shattered a skeleton instantly, scattering its bones across the stone floor. He remarked inwardly that the creature had been far weaker than he expected. The lich hissed in outrage at the insult, vowing to tear Kettle's limbs from his body. With a sweep of his staff, he summoned even more skeletons, their numbers filling the hall. The order rang out for them to eliminate the intruder. Kettle moved with explosive speed, his body blurring as he leapt among them. With each strike, bones cracked and skulls split. One by one, the skeletons collapsed under his might. In mere moments, the floor was littered with shattered remains. The lich's eyes burned brighter in disbelief. Kettle, catching his breath, reminded himself of Cassin's advice. Skeletons would only fall if their heads were destroyed. Each blow he had delivered had confirmed this truth. He also admitted to himself that the challenge was disappointing. He had expected the lich to command death knights, formidable undead warriors, not merely brittle skeletons. The lich's fury deepened. His voice shook the chamber as he declared that he would restrain himself no longer. Dark energy surged around him, and he extended his bony hand to the ground. The stones trembled, and a new figure emerged from the shadows. Clad in heavy armor, towering above the fallen skeletons, a skeletal knight rose. Unlike the fragile minions before it, this creation radiated menace. Its sword gleamed with cursed energy, and its stance was steady and disciplined. Kettle's eyes lit up with interest. He was surprised to see such a servant appear, yet he welcomed the challenge. He wondered whether the skeletal knight created by the lich held abilities different from ordinary undead. His lips curved in anticipation as he tightened his grip on his weapon. The lich gave the command, his voice dripping with malice. The skeletal knight lifted its blade and stepped forward, the sound of metal grinding against stone echoing in the chamber. The barbarian squared his shoulders, prepared to test his strength against this new foe. The skeletal knight charged forward, its blade glowing with the aura of death. Kettle raised his arm and blocked the strike without hesitation. The impact reverberated through the chamber, yet his stance did not falter. With his free hand, he countered swiftly, delivering a crushing blow that shattered the knight's armor and splintered its shield. The sound of breaking steel echoed, and pieces of armor scattered across the floor. Kettle noted calmly that this knight was sturdier than the skeletons he had destroyed earlier. The lich, Kartos Barananlas Kesses, barked a command from his throne. He ordered the knight to release all of its mana. At once, the skeletal knight was engulfed in an ominous aura, its power intensifying until the very air seemed heavy. The creature lunged forward with newfound strength, its weapon cutting through the air like a storm. Kettle received the attack head-on, studying the flow of energy coursing through his opponent. He acknowledged to himself that this creation was somewhat unusual compared to ordinary undead. Despite its amplified might, the skeletal knight proved no match for him. With a single devastating punch, Kettle shattered its body into fragments. The bones crumbled beneath his strike, and as silence fell, he stomped down on the remains to end the battle. He looked at Kartos and asked if that was truly all the lich had to offer. Kartos froze in shock, his hollow gaze widened as he demanded to know what Kettle was. When Kettle stepped back, the lich misread the gesture as fear and told him to tremble before his power. He declared that Kettle would pay dearly for invading his sanctuary. Kettle, confused, replied that he had only come because the glowing gem had summoned him. He asked if Kartos had not been the one who scattered those gems in the first place. The lich fell silent, his skeletal jaw stiffening. He realized with bitter clarity that every victim who entered this place, including the barbarian, had been lured by his own scheme. Kartos broke the silence by shouting his full name, Kartos Barananlas Kesses, and boasting of his past. He claimed he had destroyed 5 kingdoms and battled against countless heroes. Kettle, rather than being impressed, mused silently to himself that the lich's long name reminded him of the lengthy titles of elf queens. He wondered if such extravagant names were fashionable in this world. Kartos ignored the irreverence and ordered him once again to become the cornerstone of his resurrection. He raised his staff and began casting. The spell that emerged was no ordinary magic. Kettle recognized the flow of energy twisting through the chamber. It was an incantation that manipulated human emotions. Kartos had developed it himself, drawing out negative emotions and amplifying them until the victim's mind fractured beyond repair. Through this spell, he believed Kettle would be crushed within despair and fear, his soul ripe for harvest. Kartos was confident, reasoning that a barbarian with no grasp of mystery could not possibly resist such refined sorcery. Still, doubts lingered in his thoughts. Kettle's presence was strange, his resistance baffling. He wore no artifact of protection, yet stood unharmed. Kartos decided that capturing him alive for study might be wiser. He commanded his skeletal minions to seize Kettle and drag him away. The skeletons shuffled forward, weapons raised. To Kartos's dismay, Kettle simply swatted them aside. Each swing of his fists shattered skulls and ribcages, reducing them to heaps of bones on the floor. Kartos recoiled in disbelief. His mind control spell had failed completely, an impossibility in his eyes. Kettle looked at the lich with mild annoyance and asked if he was done merely standing around. He remarked that summoning more skeletons was a tedious tactic. His tone carried a mocking edge, which only deepened Kartos's fury. The lich could not comprehend what had just happened. Even legendary heroes had fallen victim to his emotion magic, yet this barbarian had resisted it effortlessly. Kettle pressed further, taunting him by asking if he was incapable of using simpler spells, like a fireball. The comparison struck Kartos as an insult, provoking his rage. He began chanting a new spell, his skeletal form glowing with waves of dark energy. The chamber shook as his voice echoed through the stone walls. The incantation drew upon the depths of the underworld, summoning a colossal tide of darkness. When the spell reached completion, he released it with a triumphant shout. A wave of pure destruction swept forward, meant to engulf the world and plunge it into endless chaos. The magical energy was so dense that the very ground quaked beneath its weight. Kettle's eyes lit up with excitement. The barbarian stood firmly, his expression bright with anticipation as the display of sorcery unfolded. The sight of such immense magic thrilled him rather than frightened him. Kartos roared for the spell to devour his foe. The tidal wave of darkness swallowed Kettle, the barbarian's figure vanishing in the consuming void. From his throne, Kartos began to laugh. His voice reverberated across the chamber as he declared victory. He was convinced that no one could survive the magnitude of that magic. However, the triumphant laughter was cut short as his body trembled. His skeletal frame collapsed to one knee, and he coughed violently. The spell had drained him entirely, consuming the last reserves of his energy. Though weakened, he remained confident that his most destructive attack had succeeded. When the smoke cleared, Kartos's confidence shattered. From the dust emerged Kettle, unharmed and standing tall. The barbarian brushed the debris from his arm as though nothing had happened. He admitted aloud that the attack had been impressive, yet questioned if that was truly the best the lich could offer. Kartos froze. His hollow eyes burned brighter with disbelief. He had unleashed the greatest spell in his arsenal, one powerful enough to shatter the mind of even a transcendent hero, yet it had no effect. He thought back to his emotion spell as well, remembering how it had been resisted with ease. Both failures shook him to the core. He asked once more, his voice laced with despair, what Kettle truly was. The barbarian replied calmly that while the spectacle of the spell had been flashy, the actual force behind it had left little impression. His words struck the lich like a hammer. Kartos's grip tightened around his staff as he realized he was facing something beyond his comprehension. Kettle stepped forward, his presence filling the chamber. He declared that if this was all the lich could do, then it was his turn to act. The lich was stunned when he realized Kettle already knew his identity. The shock quickly gave way to manic laughter, echoing through the ruined hall. He convinced himself that Kettle must be an agent of the Empire, praising their intelligence network for tracking him down so swiftly. His laughter carried madness, fueled by arrogance and desperation, as he declared that he would rise again and reclaim his rule over the world. His thoughts twisted as he evaluated Kettle. He imagined the barbarian to be a product of the Empire's infamous human farm, a place whispered about where specialized talents were bred and trained. To him, Kettle was clearly an assassin created with one purpose: to kill him. Even with this conclusion, the lich's defiance remained unshaken. He screamed that he would slaughter Kettle and crush the Empire that dared to oppose him. Kettle stood in silence, baffled by the wild claims. He found himself wondering if the lich had completely lost his sanity. The outburst sounded more like delusions than calculated threats. Nevertheless, the lich's eyes burned with frenzied determination as he prepared for a final desperate gamble. Raising his skeletal hands, he unleashed a spell and demanded Kettle's body as his own. The dark incantation struck directly at Kettle's mind. The lich attempted to enter his consciousness and claim it for himself. The narration explained the risk clearly. Once inside, the lich would be trapped in this new body for the rest of his existence unless he managed to reconstruct his form as a lich again. With triumph in his voice, he declared that Kettle's body was his. Inside Kettle's mental world, however, the lich's confidence shattered. What he saw left him speechless. The place he had entered was unlike anything he had experienced in all his centuries of existence. He wondered if this was truly the barbarian's inner world. Darkness spread endlessly, heavy and suffocating, a space where every breath seemed to crush the spirit. Merely standing there felt like it was enough to corrupt and unravel the mind. The lich's certainty turned to panic. He screamed that this could not be the work of the Empire. His voice cracked with disbelief as he tried to deny what he was witnessing. The oppressive weight of the place bore down on him, forcing his mind to fragment. His thoughts broke apart like glass, leaving nothing but despair and incoherent cries. His mental form began to collapse under the crushing influence of Kettle's inner world. Outside, Kettle stood still, his expression blank with confusion. From his perspective, the lich had muttered strange words and suddenly collapsed without warning. The once mighty being fell lifelessly, his dark aura evaporating into nothingness. Kettle's brow furrowed in disappointment. While the swirling aura and ominous presence had been impressive, in the end that was all there had been. He had expected to see grander magic, but the encounter ended far too abruptly. He concluded that liches in this world were not as formidable as the stories suggested. With the fight seemingly finished, he decided it was time to collect rewards. His attention fell on the lich's staff, lying nearby with a faint glow pulsing from its length. He picked it up, turning it in his hands, and wondered if the staff aided spellcasting. A thought crossed his mind that perhaps he could use magic with its help. Deciding not to share this discovery with anyone, he quietly resolved to keep it secret. While searching the chamber, his eyes landed on a vase. Its peculiar design made him suspect it might be the lich's life vessel. Holding it carefully, he considered taking it to Rosa for proper appraisal. Yet as he examined the throne, he felt that something was still missing. Curiosity guided him as he pressed against a hidden mechanism. A voice responded immediately, calling out the words, "Correct answer." Stone shifted and gears turned, revealing a concealed passage. Before him stretched what was labeled as the hidden sacrifice room of Kartos, the lich. Kettle stepped inside and found groups of people huddled together. Their expressions turned to alarm and fear when they saw him enter. Their whispers carried uncertainty, as though they could not comprehend what had just happened. Kettle studied them in silence, wondering who they were and how they had come to be prisoners here. For now, he decided to leave the matter unresolved. Returning to the territory with this information would be the wiser choice. Once explained, the officials would surely send someone more suited to handle the situation. Upon his return to the mercenary guild, Rosa greeted him at the entrance, noting with surprise that he was back earlier than usual. Kettle responded simply, confirming that something had come up. His mind turned to the matter of the gem he had shown her the previous day, and he told her this was related. Rosa frowned, immediately suspicious. When he explained that he had encountered a lich, she assumed he was joking. The idea of stumbling upon such a rare and dangerous creature sounded too far-fetched. She pointed out that there were only 5 liches known in the entire world, and she found it unlikely that one would be hiding in such an isolated region. Kettle remained firm, making it clear that he was not joking. To drive the point home, he presented her with the ceramic pot he had recovered from the lair. He explained that he believed it to be the lich's life vessel and asked her to appraise it. Rosa's skepticism evaporated the moment she laid eyes on the object. Her expression shifted to one of shock as realization dawned on her. The evidence in front of her left little room for doubt. The pot carried the unmistakable aura of a lich's vessel. She looked back at Kettle with a new level of seriousness, finally understanding that he had spoken the truth. Kettle explained to Rosa that there had been a few people trapped inside the lich's hideout. He mentioned that he had considered bringing them back, but their souls had already departed, leaving their bodies empty and lifeless. He decided to leave them where they were for the time being, adding that the guild should send someone more appropriate to handle the matter. Rosa listened carefully, her expression tightening as the details settled in. She began piecing things together, recalling the recent string of unexplained disappearances across the territory. The truth struck her suddenly, and she realized those missing people were most likely the victims of the lich. Fear and urgency overwhelmed her. She announced that she would call someone immediately to investigate the matter further. Not long after, the guard captain arrived, his voice booming through the hall as he demanded answers about the lich. Kettle greeted him calmly, showing no sign of alarm. When questioned, Kettle assured the captain that the threat had already been dealt with and there was nothing more to worry about. To him, it was no more than a minor inconvenience. The guard captain pressed for further details, asking if the lich's name was Kartos Barananlas Kessis. Kettle thought for a moment and replied that the name sounded familiar. At once, recognition dawned on the captain. His tone shifted, heavy with the weight of history, as he explained that Kartos had once been a sorcerer of terrifying renown. 100 years ago, he had thrown the world into turmoil with his forbidden sorcery, manipulating emotions to twist the wills of rulers and subjects alike. Kings had gone mad under his influence, and 5 kingdoms collapsed in the wake of his schemes. Kettle, however, appeared unimpressed. He remarked that the lich had not seemed particularly threatening in the end. According to him, the creature had destroyed itself through some bizarre ritual rather than through any effort on his part. The captain struggled to accept this explanation, unable to comprehend how a legendary figure could have ended in such a pitiful way. He urged Kettle to provide a clearer account, yet Kettle shrugged off the matter, stating that there was little more to tell. The guard captain realized he had no choice but to bring this matter before his lord. Later that evening, the two men met in the lord's chamber to discuss the troubling situation. The lord frowned deeply as he listened, finding it difficult to believe that a lich had hidden so close to their lands. He wondered aloud if perhaps Kettle had mistaken the creature for another kind of monster. The guard captain dismissed this thought, explaining that the testimonies of the rescued victims and the undeniable presence of the life vessel left no room for doubt. The lord grew more uneasy as the discussion continued. The discovery of a lich's life vessel within the territory was dangerous enough to attract the Empire's attention. Investigators would almost certainly be dispatched, and their scrutiny could bring unforeseen consequences. The timing could not have been worse, as their strongest warrior, swordmaster Cain, was currently absent from the territory. The lord rubbed his temples, calling the matter a great headache. He ordered preparations to send a messenger to the kingdom, acknowledging that they were fortunate the situation had been discovered early. The guard captain agreed, pointing out that if Kettle had not stumbled upon the hideout, their territory would likely have been the first to suffer the lich's wrath. The lord considered this grim possibility. He reasoned that Kartos must have been preparing for a resurrection and that such a plot so near their borders was anything but normal. Acknowledging the scale of what had been prevented, the lord admitted that Kettle's actions deserved an extraordinary reward, though he doubted his small territory had the means to provide one fitting of the deed. The following morning, the lord's sleep was broken by a servant who rushed into his chamber in panic. The servant stammered out the news that Lady Aquas, the heretic inquisitor of the sun god, had arrived. The lord's eyes widened in shock. Confusion clouded his mind as he wondered why such a high figure had come to his domain. Soon after, Lady Aquas appeared, her presence commanding and regal. The lord forced a respectful smile and welcomed her nervously, offering his name in introduction. Aquas thanked him for his courtesy and introduced herself as the heretic inquisitor of the sun god, the youngest ever to hold the title. Tales of her deeds spread far and wide. She had executed 7 sorcerers on her own and had single-handedly stopped a large-scale ritual of terrifying proportions. Her reputation was unmatched. She stood as the most powerful heretic inquisitor on the continent, wielding authority that reached beyond the rank of lords. Even the empire itself submitted to the influence of the sun god when she acted in his name. The lord, fully aware of her status, could not hide his unease. He once again wondered why she had come to such a small place as his territory. Aquas broke the silence, commenting on the recent disturbances she had heard about in the area. The lord explained that there had been a minor issue with a dungeon, though it had already been resolved. He concluded with reassurance, claiming that her visit surely had nothing to do with the lich. Curious, he asked for the true purpose of her arrival. Aquas responded with calm certainty. She explained that she had come to speak about the prophecy. Yet before she shared the details of this prophecy, she wanted confirmation about the incident in the territory. The lord's expression tightened, his voice uneasy as he asked if she meant the confrontation between the barbarian and the lich. Aquas confirmed it, her words deliberate. She stated that the lich in question was most likely none other than Kartos Barananlas Kessis. The lord's composure cracked, astonished that she already knew the name. Aquas continued, declaring that the proof had already been secured. The Lord presented her with the Lich's life vessel. The sight of the object made Aquas's eyes widen in disbelief. She was visibly shaken as she examined it, unable to deny the truth it represented. Her voice trembled slightly as she asked if the barbarian who had destroyed the Lich was still present in the territory.